They never saw the marble. The peasants, the farmers, the ones who rose with the lice and slept with the dust. They did not live among white pillars or under the poetic shade of olive trees strung with philosophy. They lived in huts that sweated when it rained and cracked when it didn't. The walls bled mud in the winter and dust in the summer. Their floors were dirt, their ceilings thatch. The smell of goat seeped into everything. Goats that screamed through the night like dying children, tethered with frayed rope, chewing on splinters, urinating in their own feed. The mornings began before color returned to the sky. There was no breakfast, just movement, cold water slapped across the face, if it hadn't frozen, feet shoved into stiff sandals, if sandals existed. More often, just feet, calloused and cracked and smeared in whatever the animals left behind. The work didn't begin because there was no beginning. There was no distinction between living and labor. It was all survival. You were born into the plow or the loom or the kiln. You inhaled your father's ash. You bled into your mother's wool. You didn't learn your name from their lips. You learned it from what they cursed when things broke. The air smelled of dung and wood smoke and wet straw. And sometimes, if you were unlucky, of rotting teeth. Because the dead were rarely buried with haste, winter froze the ground too hard. Summer filled the holes with flies. They say the Greeks loved beauty, but beauty was something squeezed from the suffering of the many to dress the leisure of the few. You would never own a statue. You might pass one, once, as you dragged fish guts through the market or piss-soaked straw to the edge of town. You wouldn't look up at it. You knew better than to invite the gaze of the gods, or the rich, or anyone taller than you. The gods didn't care. You prayed anyway. Not because you believed, but because you were afraid not to. You burned barley, poured cheap oil, whispered promises you could never keep. Sometimes you smeared your blood on the stone. Sometimes it was someone else's. The temples smelled of mold and old smoke, and the breath of priests who had never plowed a field. If your child got sick, you asked the gods. If your crops died, you blamed the gods. If your husband beat you, you hid it from the gods, because you knew they enjoyed pain. That's why there were so many stories about it. That's why the heroes always suffered. Suffering was divine. You just weren't divine enough for it to mean anything. Food was not a meal. It was an interruption. A handful of barley. A piece of dried fish, if you hadn't already fed it to the cat to stop it from waking the baby. Wine was for the men, sour and diluted, and often full of vinegar. Women drank water when it didn't kill them. Children ate what was left. There was never anything left. Nights were not quiet. Dogs howled. Babies cried. Rats scratched. Husbands groaned in their sleep, dreaming of wars they would never fight, or women they would never touch. Wives stared at the ceiling, wondering if tomorrow would bring a clean cloth or another miscarriage. The walls had ears. Thin mud heard everything. The neighbors fought too. Everyone did. There were no secrets, only silence. And silence was dangerous. Illness came with the wind. One day you could walk, the next you were crawling, and the third you were being dragged out back. If there was time, they'd lay you in olive leaves. If not, they'd cover you with a blanket and call the pigs off. You might be buried. You might not. No one would remember. The names carved in stone were never yours. Children didn't play. They mimicked. They mimicked labor. They mimicked sex. They mimicked violence. They learned by watching bruises bloom. They learned by holding their breath when the soldiers passed. They learned by silence. Education was for boys who didn't smell like goats. You smelled like goats. So you learned how to twist a neck, how to cheat a scale, how to tell when the bread was turning green. Dreams were dangerous. If you dreamt too loud, someone might think you wanted more. And wanting more was the first step to having less. So you didn't dream. You remembered. You remembered how your sister died in childbirth, how your brother drowned under a boat too heavy to lift, how your uncle drank lye by accident and took 3 days to stop screaming. You remembered, and you endured. Marriage was not love, it was transaction. You were traded like grain. You were measured by your hips, your teeth, your father's debts. You bled on the wedding cloth, or they said you were ruined. You carried babies before your breasts knew how to feed them. You buried babies before your arms learned to name them. You were never a girl. You were a wife. Or you were trouble. If you were born wrong, they might leave you on a hill. If you cried, they might come back. If they didn't, you became food. The sun was not warmth. It was punishment. It cracked lips. It boiled brains. It made sweat sting your eyes, while your hands bled into the earth. The earth took everything. Your strength, your spit, your blood, your babies. And still it asked for more. You gave, because to not give was to be seen, and to be seen was to be punished. Sometimes by a man, sometimes by a priest, sometimes by something that didn't wear a face but always watched. They said the gods walked among them, but if the gods ever walked where you lived, they did so with disgust, and you learned to bow even lower. There were stories, of course, always stories, but they belonged to others. You heard them in the marketplace, twisted and loud. Hercules lifting bulls, Odysseus tricking Cyclope, women turned into trees to escape men who wouldn't listen. You didn't hear yourself in them. You heard warnings. Don't be too clever. Don't be too fast. Don't be too loud. Don't be too real. Even the myths punished women for surviving, and men for wanting peace. No one got to rest. Rest was for death, and even then it wasn't guaranteed. Some said the dead waited in a field. Some said they burned in the earth. Some said they wandered forever, crying. You didn't wonder which was true. You were too tired to think, too tired to hope. You just worked. You just bled. You just kept breathing, even when it hurt, because maybe tomorrow the bread wouldn't be moldy. Maybe tomorrow the baby would stop coughing. Maybe tomorrow the sun wouldn't burn so loud. Maybe tomorrow you'd forget what it felt like to want. Not more, just something different. You didn't cry in front of others. Not because you were strong, but because you knew what happened to those who showed weakness. The gods punished pity. Men punished emotion. Women punished deviation. And the animals, they watched. Even they could smell fear. So you learned to swallow tears before they reached your cheeks. You blinked slowly. You clenched your teeth. You learned to scream inwardly. The first lesson of life was silence. The second was obedience. And the third was to never confuse the two. Silence did not mean safety. Obedience did not mean mercy. They were just layers between you and pain. If you were lucky, they held. Most days they didn't. You spoke in half sentences. You nodded more than you meant. You bowed not just your head, but your back, your shoulders, your heart. The posture of a servant was more than protection. It was survival. Even the children knew it. They bowed before they spoke. They waited before they asked. They flinched before they were hit. No one taught them this. The world did. It seeped into them through every look, every touch, every slap that wasn't explained. They learned to hold breath better than to hold toys. Because toys didn't last. Nothing did. You never owned anything fully. The shirt on your back belonged to your older brother before you. The pot in the corner belonged to your grandmother. The dog belonged to no one but followed because it was fed. You belonged to your father, then your husband, then the grave. There was no moment of you, only echoes of others. Even your voice carried their weight. You didn't speak your own name. Others did, when they needed something, when they wanted to scold, to demand, to take. You answered out of habit, not identity. The few times you heard your name in softness, it sounded foreign, like a kindness you couldn't trust. And so you didn't. You distrusted everything that felt good. A warm day meant drought. A ripe fig meant wasps. A kind man meant danger. The world had trained you to expect loss. So much so that even when joy stumbled in, you tensed, waiting for it to be ripped away. And it always was. Joy didn't linger in places like this. It passed through like a shadow cast by someone else's sun. Laughter existed, but it was sharp, fast, and filled with warning. You didn't laugh freely. You laughed like you were dodging something, because often you were. You learned to listen for the shift, the pause in footsteps, the click in a voice, the breath that held too long. These were the signals. They told you when to run, when to lower your eyes, when to make yourself smaller. You were always shrinking. Not just your body, your hope, your dreams, your memory. You shrank until there was nothing left to take. And even then, they found ways. They took your hours, your youth, your softness, your skin cracked under sun, your bones bent under weight, your teeth loosened from meals you couldn't chew. You bled from places you didn't understand. And when you asked, they said it was normal, that it meant you were becoming useful, that now you could carry life, as if you hadn't already been carrying too much. When you gave birth, you didn't scream, or if you did, no one came. You lay on straw, with blood that stuck to your legs for days, and a baby that may or may not survive. If it died, they said it was the gods. If it lived, they said it was your duty. No one asked how you felt. Feelings were a luxury. You didn't feel. You functioned. You moved because to stop was to sink. And no one helped the sinking. They watched. They gossiped. They judged. And then they walked away. Sometimes you imagined being someone else. Not rich. Just unbroken. Someone who didn't wake up sore. Who didn't have lice in their hair. Who didn't flinch at every raised hand. But even imagining that felt dangerous. So you stopped. Your mind built walls, not to protect you from the world, but to keep your dreams from escaping. Because if they escaped, they might be seen. And if they were seen, they might be destroyed. It was safer to not want. Wanting made you visible. And visibility was pain. The stories you were told didn't help. They weren't meant to. They were tools of control. Myths weren't entertainment. They were warnings. Pandora opened a box and ruined everything. Echo talked too much and was punished with disappearance. Medusa was violated and then cursed. Women who moved were cursed. Men who paused were punished. There was no heroism in gentleness, no reward in restraint. Strength was measured in conquest, in dominance, in how loudly you could hurt others. And those who suffered? They became lessons, parables, cautionary tales. You learned them by heart, not because you loved them, but because forgetting them could cost you your life. You were not allowed to forget. Not your place, not your role, not your limitations. When you walked to the well, you kept your eyes low. When you passed a soldier, you stepped aside. When you saw a priest, you prayed you were clean enough not to be noticed. Purity was power, but only when granted by others. You couldn't claim it. You couldn't keep it. It could be taken in a moment, and no one would call it theft. They'd call it sacrifice, or worse, destiny. You hated the stars, not because they were cold, but because they looked down and never blinked. You hated the sea, not because it was dangerous, but because it was free. You hated the statues, not because they were beautiful, but because they were unmoving, untouched by time, perfect in their stillness while you crumbled. You hated the gods, but you prayed, not for salvation, for silence, for them to forget your name, to pass over your house, to leave your children alone. You prayed not to be chosen, because being chosen meant suffering. It always did, and you had already suffered enough. They didn't teach you how to live. They taught you how not to die. And even that wasn't guaranteed. The knowledge passed down wasn't written in books or carved in stone. It was bruises, stories whispered behind hands, Instructions coded in glances. Your grandmother had scars on her arms she never explained. Your grandfather lost his eye in a harvest accident no one talked about. Your mother walked with a limp that came from falling, and your father drank water from the same jar as the animals. There was no inheritance. There was only repetition. You did what they did because you didn't know another way. If you asked why, the answer was always the same. Because it's how it's always been. The phrase was a wall. You couldn't climb over it. You couldn't dig under it. You learned to live against it, your back pressed to the cold stone of tradition. You married young, not because you were ready, because your mother had, and her mother before her, and her mother before that. You birthed children because you were told to. You raised them the same way you were raised, with hard hands and soft silences. You told them to be quiet, to be grateful, to obey, even when you wanted to tell them to run. But there was nowhere to run. The village was small. The world outside it, dangerous. You believed this because you had to. Because if freedom was possible, then your cage was self-made. And that was too much to carry. So you passed on the cage, with careful hands, with love, even. Because love didn't look like kindness. It looked like survival. You beat your son so he wouldn't be beaten worse by others. You hushed your daughter's laughter so it wouldn't draw attention. You fed them first, but you told them to never expect it again. Hope was a fragile thing, and you'd seen too many children crushed by it. Better to teach them hunger, to make them strong, to make them endure. You didn't know if it was right, but you knew it was necessary. You remembered your own childhood in flashes, the taste of burnt bread, the sound of your father cursing the sky, the smell of wet wool and old blood, the cold that crawled into your bones and made a home. You remembered watching your mother cry in the corner, thinking she was alone. You remembered the sting of your brother's hand when you spoke out of turn. You remembered lying awake, listening for the scream that meant the baby didn't make it, and then the silence that meant she didn't either. These were your lessons, not arithmetic, not philosophy, not history. Pain, loss, waiting, wanting, learning to keep your mouth shut and your eyes open, learning to measure love by what it didn't do. He didn't hit you today. She didn't scream. They left you alone. That was love. You learned to survive by counting absences. You told yourself stories, not to believe them, but to fill the silence. You told your children that the gods watched over them, that heroes were real, that justice came to those who waited. You didn't believe it, but it helped them sleep. And sleep was rare. The nights were full of coughs and nightmares and things that scurried in the walls. You slept with one ear open, always, because danger didn't knock. It crept. It slithered. It fell from the rafters or burst through the door. You had to be ready, and so you were. Always half-dressed, half-fed, half-awake. You didn't know what wholeness felt like. Only fractions. Your soul felt like a puzzle with pieces swapped between generations. Your hands carried your mother's burns. Your eyes bore your father's fear. Your voice cracked in the same places your grandmother's did. You were not just you. You were everyone before you, packed into one body and told to keep going. And so you did. You kept going, even when your legs shook, even when your teeth loosened, even when your back screamed. You didn't stop because there was no one to catch you. Rest was luxury. Idleness was sin. Motion was virtue. Even if it led nowhere, you moved, because movement was proof you hadn't died. Yet, children asked questions. They always did. Why do we do this? Why can't I? Why did she die? You answered with silence, or with lies, because the truth was too heavy and too useless. Knowing why didn't change what was. It just made it hurt more. So you told them it was the gods, or fate, or time, or luck. Anything but what you knew. That it had always been this way, because no one strong enough to stop it ever bothered. Or they became part of it, because even kindness could be weaponized. You saw it happen. A neighbor shared bread, and suddenly people demanded it every day. A man helped a stranger and was accused of theft. A woman nursed a sick child and caught the illness herself. Kindness was punished. Cruelty was expected. So you became cruel. Not by choice, by necessity. Your love became harsh. Your generosity conditional. Your trust non-existent. You taught your children to be hard. And when they grew hard, you mourned the softness they lost. But you didn't show it. You said you were proud. You clapped them on the shoulder and said, "You're ready." Ready for what? You didn't say. They'd find out soon enough. And when they did, they'd come to you, eyes wide, full of the same disappointment you once felt. You'd nod and say nothing, because you knew what they needed wasn't comfort. It was confirmation that they weren't crazy, that life really was this bad, and always had been, that suffering wasn't failure. It was the only path available, and if they could walk it, they could survive. That was your gift. Not joy, not ease, but preparation. And when they had children, they'd pass it on, wrapped in the same silence, laced with the same fear and hope. Hope became a luxury you didn't mention, a dream you buried with your mother, a wish you once made on a star that never moved. You looked up sometimes, not to pray, but to remember that there was once a sky above all this, that once someone must have imagined something better, and maybe, just maybe, one day someone else would again. You smelled sickness before you saw it. It lived in the streets, in the corners of homes, in the breath of strangers. The air itself carried it. Hot, thick, buzzing with flies. People didn't cough behind hands. They hacked openly. Wounds oozed. Eyes wept pus. Children walked barefoot through the rot. You got used to it. You had to. You could not hold your breath forever. The temples were no better. Sanctuaries, they called them. But inside, the floors were sticky with blood and oil, and the air reeked of burned offerings and old sweat. Goats were sacrificed. Their necks slid on stones still red from yesterday. People prayed while slipping on entrails. You brought coins you couldn't spare to buy the illusion of healing. A priest waved smoke over your body and muttered words that didn't help. You were told to bathe in river water mixed with crushed herbs. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. If you survived, the gods were praised. If you didn't, you were at fault. The body was weak, they said. The mind impure. Everything was your fault. You ate what you could steal, grow, or beg for. Bread was hard. Cheese, sour. Fish, if you had it, was half rotten by the time it reached the table. You learned to chew fast and swallow faster. Hunger made everything taste like victory. There was no such thing as full, only less hungry. Water came from the well. If it was cloudy, you drank it anyway. Better dysentery than thirst. You squatted over holes in the ground. Flies buzzed around your ankles. Privacy didn't exist. Cleanliness was theoretical. You wiped with stones, or leaves, or nothing. You bled into your clothes. You bled and were told it was womanhood. You worked through it. You walked through it. You weren't allowed to rest. Illness wasn't a reason. Pain wasn't a reason. You worked because everyone else did. And if you stopped, someone else took your place. The market was loud and dangerous. Men shouted. Hands grabbed. Eyes followed. Your coin purse stayed hidden. Your voice stayed quiet. You bartered because you couldn't afford not to. A loaf of bread for a piece of cloth. A chicken for a night's safety. Everything had a price, including your silence. Especially your silence. Men were treated for sickness with leeches, wine, and gods. Women were treated with suspicion. Your womb wandered, they said. Your mind was soft. You were hysterical. The cure was a husband, or confinement, or exorcism. You screamed into your pillow and bit your tongue. Sometimes you hurt yourself just to feel something real. You walked barefoot until your heels split. You pressed your back against cold stone walls to stay awake. You bathed in rivers full of dead things. You prayed to gods you didn't believe in. You watched animals be worshipped while children starved. You saw rats fatten on grain stored for festivals. You watched your neighbor die from a cut on his leg. Infection spread fast. It crawled under the skin like fire. You smelled him before you realized he was gone. No one cleaned the body. They dragged it to the edge of the village and left it for the dogs. There were no funerals, only disposal. You dreamed of death often, not because you wanted it, but because it felt like rest. And rest was holy. The streets burned in summer. Your sandals melted. Your skin blistered. The shade was a gift, but there was no such thing as shade without permission. Trees grew on rich land. Walls were high. You walked in the open, head bowed, eyes low. You drank from cracked jars and ate figs full of ants. The heat lived in your bones. Sleep came only when you collapsed. You woke covered in sweat and fear. You worked in olive groves, picking fruit that wasn't yours. You carried baskets heavier than your body. You bled from your fingers. You were paid in promises. You were watched, always watched, not by gods, by men. Their eyes weighed you, judged you, picked you apart. You didn't look at them. Looking was invitation. Speaking was challenge. Silence was shield. You learned to speak only when spoken to, and even then, to choose your words like seeds. Few, careful, buried deep. You wrapped yourself in cloth that chafed. You tied your hair until your scalp ached. You smiled when they told you to. You knelt when they asked. You danced for coins. You sang for silence. You pretended joy, because pretending kept you alive. Real joy was dangerous. It made you soft, made you forget how to flinch. You needed your flinch. It was your armor. They beat you for mistakes. They beat you for truths. They beat you for being. The bruises didn't matter. The silence did. If you stayed quiet, you might be spared tomorrow. If you cried, they'd call you ungrateful. You were nothing, and yet you had to act like everything was enough. You cleaned other people's messes. You stitched their clothes, fed their babies, mended their shoes. You were invisible unless needed. Then suddenly, you were expected to be perfect. Fast, quiet, invisible again. You watched the sun rise without wonder. The moon meant wolves. The wind meant change. Change never helped you. Change meant war. Soldiers marching. Doors kicked in. Food stolen. Women taken. Change meant screams in the night and smoke in the morning. So you feared it and prayed for sameness. Even suffering, if familiar, felt safer than hope. You didn't cry when your sister disappeared. You didn't ask questions. You knew the answers. They all did. Her sandals were found by the well, her scarf near the barracks. No one spoke. No one searched. Your mother burned her things and told you to forget. You didn't forget, but you learned to pretend. You built your memory into a room, locked the door, swallowed the key. You kept going, because that was the only thing you knew. You kept your head down, your hands busy, your mouth shut. You lived, and called it survival. You were born into a world already spoken for. Your name wasn't yours. It was chosen by someone who believed they owned your future. And maybe they did. You didn't decide what you would do. You didn't choose where you would live. You were born into a role and told it was fate. The gods, they said, the stars, the blood in your veins. Everything was pre-written, and your only duty was to accept your place quietly. You were taught to kneel before the statues, to bow before priests, to obey men in robes who claimed to speak for Olympus. You questioned nothing. To question was to risk blasphemy, and blasphemy was a death sentence. Not in law, though, sometimes. Yes, but in life. A mark on your name, a curse on your family, a reason for others to turn away when you spoke. So you stopped speaking. You listened to lies, to sermons, to the same stories told over and over, that your suffering was sacred, that your pain was noble, that the gods watched and would reward you later, always later. The temples stood taller than homes. They gleamed while you slept on dirt. They burned incense while you burned with fever. Their floors were polished with the blood of animals you could never afford to eat. You brought your offerings anyway, because what if it worked? What if this time the gods were watching? You gave your last coin for a promise. You wept in secret so no one would call it weakness. Religion wasn't comfort, it was currency. You paid in obedience, you paid in shame, you paid in silence. You were not allowed to grieve loudly. Mourning had rules. Grief was public only for those who mattered. For everyone else, it was a whisper, a shadow, a mouthful of dirt. And if you were enslaved, you had even less. No name of your own, no place to call yours, no sleep without permission, no food unless given. Your breath was borrowed, your back was property. You were sold, traded, punished, touched, broken, and then told to be grateful. Your canes weren't always metal. Sometimes they were words. Sometimes they were prayers. You knelt not because you believed, but because you'd seen what happened to those who stood. You saw a man flayed for refusing to kiss a ring, a woman stoned for speaking her truth, a child silenced for asking, why? And in your heart, a small voice whispered the same question, but you smothered it. You had to. Questions were dangerous. They led to thoughts, and thoughts led to pain. So you thought about safe things, about the weather, about market days, about how many steps from the well to your home, about how to keep your face blank when the overseer passed. You didn't dream. Dreaming was luxury. You had nightmares instead. Ones where your master never died, where the priest always knew your secrets, where your child grew up only to inherit your chains. You kept your fears folded tight inside you like old cloth. You carried them with you everywhere, in the fields, in the kitchens, in the silence between chores. They became your rhythm, your lullaby, your law. The law wasn't written for you. You didn't know how to read it. You only knew how it felt. Heavy, sharp, one-sided. It bent for the rich. It broke on your back. You could be whipped for looking wrong, for speaking at the wrong time, for being in the wrong place, for being born the wrong person. They said it was justice. You knew better. It was fear, weaponized, institutionalized, normalized. They taught it in the streets, reinforced it in temples, whispered it at night. Children learned to fear before they learned to write. Girls were told to hide. Boys were told to strike. And if you were neither, or both, or unsure, you were erased. The system had no room for complexity. It barely had room for breath. Everything had to fit a box. Every person, a purpose. Every day, a repetition. The same prayers, the same bowing, the same calloused hands, tying the same ropes. And if you rebelled, if you even thought of it, you were alone. There was no rebellion, only escape. And even escape was rare. Where would you go? The forests were full of wolves, the mountains of worse things. Strangers were not kind. They didn't free you. They captured you, enslaved you again. Or worse, you heard stories of those who ran, of those who vanished. They were never spoken of again. Silence was safer. Compliance, more survivable. So you didn't run. You stayed. You endured. You found small freedoms. A hidden piece of bread. A moment of stillness. A song hummed so softly no one else could hear. You created beauty in shadows. Art in whispers. You braided resistance into your hair. You wrote truth on the inside of your bones. And still, the world called you nothing. It spat on your footsteps. It forgot your name. You mourned yourself while alive. You performed your own eulogy every time you bowed to a master. And yet you remained, not because of hope, but because of something deeper, something older, a will that no whip could break. You didn't survive to be remembered. You survived because there was no other choice. And that, too, was sacred. Even if no one said so, even if the gods turned their faces, even if the law erased you, you existed. You endured. That was your rebellion. That was your power. You woke before the sun not because you wanted to, but because you had to. The world didn't ask if you were tired. It didn't care if your back ached or your feet bled. You were expected to move, to sweep, to carry, to serve. You greeted the day with bent knees and lowered eyes, not because you were humble, but because standing tall was dangerous. Arrogance, they called it. Pride. And pride was punished. You learned to swallow your name like a secret. Not everything was taken from you at once. It was chipped away. A ritual, a rhythm, a cycle of diminishing. They made you kneel first for the gods, then for the elders, then for the men, then for everyone. You were taught to ask for nothing, to speak softly, to obey quickly. They called it discipline. You knew it was erasure. Your thoughts were not yours. They were shaped by myths, rewritten each season to suit someone else's agenda. A man lifted a rock and became a hero. A woman asked a question and became a warning. You stopped dreaming of being the former. You prayed not to become the latter. You prayed not because you believed, but because everyone else did, or claimed to. And you had to look like them, to sound like them, to bow when they bowed, cry when they cried, nod at stories you no longer understood. It wasn't belief, it was survival. You watched people dance for gods who never spoke. You watched them offer their last olive, their child's bread, their own blood. You did the same. Not because it helped, but because not doing it might hurt. They said the gods punished the faithless. You knew the faithful suffered just the same. You watched a boy burn from fever while his mother wept into the dirt. The priest said it was the will of Apollo. You knew it was the well. The water was tainted. But saying so would brand you a heretic. So you said nothing. You let silence grow like a vine around your truth. Shame was currency. It bought silence. It bought obedience. You wore it like a second skin. You weren't born ashamed. You were taught that your body was temptation, that your voice was disruption, that your wants were wicked. You learned to flinch before being struck, to hide hunger, to smile through pain, because not smiling brought questions, and questions brought danger. You learned to apologize for breathing too loud, for taking up space, for existing. You weren't alone in this. The village was full of silent people, eyes cast down, shoulders curled, laughs that didn't reach the eyes, grief that never left the body. It hovered in the streets, in the market, in the temple. You could feel it when someone passed. A heaviness, a resignation, the knowledge that nothing would change, that even if you lived to old age, you would carry the same burdens, bury the same sorrows, leave behind nothing but worn sandals and unmarked graves. The rituals were constant, not because they brought meaning, but because meaning had fled, and routine was the only thing left. You repeated the same phrases, the same blessings, the same instructions passed from mouths that had forgotten why they mattered. You moved your hands the way your mother had. You washed the floor in circular motions. You braided your hair with trembling fingers. You memorized prayers like lullabies, not to invoke power, but to fill the silence, to keep the darkness from speaking. You watched your friends disappear into marriages, into servitude, into early graves. You whispered their names to the stars, hoping they'd hear or forget. You weren't sure which was kinder. The children played in dust. They didn't know yet. They didn't carry the shame, but they would, soon. It always came, like winter, like drought, like death. You saw it in their eyes when they were corrected for laughing too loud, for touching a boy's hand, for asking about the stars. You watched their brightness dim, and you said nothing. Because it was the way, because if you spoke, they'd take your voice too. The silence wasn't peace. It was policy, a learned behavior, a survival instinct. Like tucking your feet in at night so the rats wouldn't bite. Like counting the steps of the guard before sneaking to the well. Like folding grief into a song and pretending it was just a melody. You forgot what joy felt like. Not because it didn't exist, but because you couldn't trust it. Joy was followed by punishment, by loss, by reminders of your place, of your smallness, of the danger in being seen. So you dimmed yourself. You blurred your edges. You moved like smoke through the alleys. You learned to disappear in daylight, to wear invisibility like armor. And sometimes you whispered to yourself, just to hear a voice that didn't lie, that didn't chant, that didn't judge. You whispered your own name, just to remember it. You stared at the moon and asked questions you could never say aloud. And for a moment, you felt like maybe, somewhere, someone had also asked them, had also sat on a rooftop with splinters in their thighs, wondering if life was supposed to hurt this much, and maybe that someone had lived, had endured, had whispered their own name into the dark, and maybe that was enough. You weren't brave, you weren't strong, but you were still here, still waking up, still walking, still carrying the shame, the silence, the rituals, and somehow, that meant something. Not everything, not enough, but something. You didn't own land. You worked it. Someone else reaped the profits while you broke your back under the sun. You were born into a family that measured time by harvests and deaths, not seasons. You didn't ask why the grain you grew wasn't yours, or why the wine pressed from your hands ended up in the cup of a man who never worked a day. That was how it was. That was how it had always been. You learned the rhythm of labor before you learned your own thoughts. Hands bled before your tongue formed words. You carried olives, dug trenches, fed animals, and buried people. You didn't cry because crying didn't bring water or bread. It brought bruises, or worse nothing. The fields didn't care about your feelings. The sun didn't pause because your sister was dying. The rain didn't come because you prayed. But you prayed anyway. Everyone did. They said the gods favored the humble. So you were humble. Not by choice, but by necessity. You didn't dare think yourself important. That was a dangerous luxury. Men with ambition ended up nailed to posts, or exiled, or silenced. And you couldn't afford silence. Your voice was your only tool, your only proof that you existed, even if no one listened. You lived in a house made of stone and dirt, shared with more people than space. You slept beside siblings, grandparents, strangers sometimes. Privacy was a myth, a thing only the rich spoke of in bathhouses. You relieved yourself behind the house, hoping no one saw. You washed with water too cold and too scarce. Soap didn't exist. Clean clothes were rare. Lice were common. Illness even more so. You accepted sickness like weather. Fevers came. Rashes spread. Coughs lingered. Sometimes they left. Sometimes people didn't. You built your days around staying unnoticed. Not because you had secrets, but because attention was dangerous. The overseer noticed. You worked harder. The tax collector noticed. You paid more. The soldier noticed. You bled. You learned to walk quietly, to nod instead of speak, to lower your eyes and make yourself smaller. You weren't invisible, just ignorable. That was safer. You watched neighbors disappear. Some fled dead. Some were taken for war. Some simply stopped showing up. No one asked. No one wanted to be next. You listened for rumors and pretended not to. You held onto information like currency, not for power but for survival. Knowing where the guards drank or when the boats came in could mean the difference between life and starvation. You worked in silence, but thought in chaos. The city walls looked sturdy, but inside was rot. Power feasted while you fasted. Politics happened on hills you could not climb. You knew the names of men who had never stepped into mud. You cheered when told. You mourned when told. Your emotions were not yours. They belonged to the polis, to the elders, to the state. You didn't learn to read unless someone important decided you were worth the effort. Words were tools, and you were not meant to wield them. You listened to others read laws that governed your life. You could not argue. You could not appeal. You could only obey. The courts were not for you, the assemblies not for you. Even if you were a man, a citizen, a free man, there were still walls, still boundaries, still men richer, louder, more powerful. If you were a woman, the walls were taller. If you were a slave, the walls were endless. You bled for other people's causes. You died for cities that did not remember your name. You marched with sandals that split after a day. You slept under carts, beside oxen, on straw. You were told your sacrifice was noble, that history would honor you. But you knew history only remembered the victors, and you were not one. You watched festivals you weren't allowed to attend. You heard music you couldn't dance to. You smelled food you'd never taste. You clapped from the edge, smiled through hunger, laughed with the crowd so they wouldn't see your envy, so they wouldn't see your truth. You weren't bitter. Bitterness was for those who expected more. You had no expectations, only duties. You fed the animals. You repaired nets. You patched sandals with twine. You kissed the feet of statues and hoped it would buy one day of peace. You measured life in chores, not in joy. You weren't taught to love. You were taught to marry, to reproduce, to create soldiers, citizens, workers. Your body wasn't yours. It was a vessel, a resource, a thing to be managed. If it failed, you were blamed. If it succeeded, you were ignored. You watched children cry for mothers already buried. You watched men break under burdens they pretended not to feel. You watched women disappear into kitchens and never come out. And still, you woke up. Still, you kept going, because stopping wasn't allowed. Because stopping meant someone else suffered more. Because you didn't know anything else. You weren't brave. You were exhausted. You weren't hopeful. You were numb. You didn't dream of freedom. You dreamed of rest. Of one day without hunger. 1 hour without pain. You didn't believe in miracles, but you believed in endurance. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was holy. Maybe that was the only rebellion left. They told you Greece was the cradle of civilization. They forgot to mention it was only for some. They painted beauty in marble and called it eternal. But the hands that carved it were blistered, cracked, and forgotten. You saw statues of gods with perfect bodies, chiseled and serene, towering above you as if to remind you of your own imperfection. You were not that. You were dirt under their feet. Art was not for you. It lived in temples you couldn't enter, spoken in tongues you couldn't read. Philosophy bloomed in shaded courtyards, far from the stink of the streets. You heard of Socrates, but only through whispers. You knew Plato's name, but not his words. No one taught them to you. Knowledge was gated. Literacy was a privilege. You repeated proverbs passed through generations like cracked bowls, chipped and incomplete. You weren't asked to think. You were told what to believe. Questioning was dangerous. Ideas belonged to the rich. The agora bustled with voices, but not yours. You swept around the stalls, kept your head down as men with scrolls debated virtue and justice. You weren't invited. If you stopped to listen too long, they scowled, or laughed, or moved away. You weren't the audience. You were background, the chorus, a body, not a mind. And if you were a woman, you were invisible, not just ignored, erased. Your thoughts didn't matter. Your presence was shameful. You weren't allowed to learn, to speak in public, to own your voice. If you dared, you were called mad, or worse, cursed. You watched young men escorted to tutors while you were taught to keep the hearth warm. They wrote poems. You memorized recipes. They discussed the stars. You stared into the fire and wondered if it hurt to burn. Theater, they said, was for all, but not for you. Not truly. You stood in the dirt at the back of the amphitheater, straining to hear, smelling the sweat of bodies pressed close. You watched masked actors weep and scream and triumph. You clapped when the others clapped. You laughed late or early, never right. You didn't understand the metaphors. The stories weren't for you. They were about kings, gods, wars. You were none of those things. You were a shadow at the edge. Music echoed through marble halls you'd never enter. Lute strummed by soft fingers, not scarred ones. You sang to soothe a child, not to perform. Your songs were dismissed as peasant noise, but they held more truth than any lyre. Your melodies carried grief older than cities, but no one listened. You watched as history wrote itself around you, never through you. You were not a citizen, not a philosopher, not a poet. You were the reason the city ran, but never the reason it was remembered. You carved truth into wood and no one saw it. You stitched sorrow into fabric, and they wore it without knowing. You sculpted with calloused hands but were never called an artist. Your thoughts were valid, but invalidated. Your soul capable of brilliance, but dulled by survival. They built academies, but not for you. The library's scrolls were not yours to touch. You walked past them with eyes cast low, wondering what knowledge lived inside. You'd never know, and maybe that was the point. You were not supposed to know. You were supposed to serve, to believe that truth lived elsewhere in marble heads, in inked parchment, in male voices. You were not truth. You were labor. You kept the city alive while others claimed to civilize it. You cleaned blood from floors after debates about justice. You stitched sandals for men who theorized about freedom. You harvested grain while they wrote about abundance. You weren't thanked. You weren't acknowledged. And yet, you absorbed more wisdom than they could see. You learned to read pain in silence, to feel change in wind, to know hunger by the look in someone's eyes. Your philosophy lived in your bones, in knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, in understanding which truths were safe. You built your own culture in stolen moments. A joke at dusk, a story by firelight, a whispered prayer not to the gods, but to your own aching spirit. Your rituals were quiet, your beauty uncarved, your knowledge unwritten, but it was there, alive, enduring, and they never knew, because they never asked. You didn't wake up angry anymore. That left long ago, burned away by the sun and scraped off with every day you dragged your feet through the dirt. You stopped expecting fairness, not because you didn't deserve it, but because deserving meant nothing. You watched the seasons change and felt nothing. Harvests came and went. People came and went. The gods didn't. Neither did the taxes. Neither did the rules. You walked in a world already written. With no pen in your hand, you stopped asking questions. Questions were dangerous. Questions dug into old wounds. They brought answers you didn't want or couldn't use. You learned that silence was not weakness. It was armor. You nodded when told, smiled when expected, agreed when it cost less than the truth. You remembered stories from your childhood, tales of heroes who fought injustice. You didn't believe them, Maybe you never did. Or maybe you just couldn't afford to. Hope was expensive. You watched people try to rise. They always fell harder. The louder they spoke, the quicker they vanished. You weren't a fool. You knew your place. And your place was survival. Not dignity, not joy, not even peace. Just breath. Just waking up and doing it all again. You told yourself you were strong, but it wasn't strength. It was exhaustion disguised as endurance. You told yourself you were free, but freedom without choice was a cruel joke. You could leave, technically, but where would you go? You had no coin, no protection, no name that mattered. The world outside your village wasn't kinder, just different in its cruelty. So you stayed, not out of love, not out of loyalty, but because you were trapped in routine, in a rhythm too old to fight. You watched your children grow with the same dull eyes. You didn't warn them. You didn't want to kill their spark before the world did. Let them dream a little longer, you thought. Let them believe the statues mean something. The scrolls, the prayers. Let them believe the city cares. You whispered blessings over their heads, hoping the wind would carry them further than your voice ever could. You spoke to the gods because you had no one else. You didn't expect answers, just a pause, just a second where the pain was lighter, where the ache in your joints quieted. You prayed for small things, an extra loaf, a dry blanket, a night without shouting. You stopped asking for happiness. That word didn't belong to you. It belonged to theater masks, to myths, to philosophers who never carried water or buried a child. You listened to people speak of honor and virtue and balance. You didn't laugh. That would have taken too much energy. You just listened, nodded, and kept sweeping. You learned to disappear in the middle of a room, to make your soul so small it couldn't be broken, to wrap your heart in layers of routine and pretend that numbness was peace. People called you obedient, faithful, wise, but they didn't see you. Not really. They saw what they wanted to. You played your part well. You didn't complain. You didn't scream. You didn't resist. And they mistook that for contentment, for grace. But you remembered the time before you learned to wear masks, before you learned the weight of your name, before you understood that your body wasn't yours, that your future was already decided. You remembered the moment it broke, when you looked at the stars and felt nothing, when you heard laughter and didn't flinch from envy, when you realized you didn't care if tomorrow came. You weren't suicidal. That would imply desire. You didn't desire anything anymore. Not love, not justice, not even revenge. Just quiet, just a long sleep. You dreamed of lying in the field and letting the sky swallow you, of sinking into earth and becoming something unthinking, a root, a rock, a thing with no past. You weren't alone in this. You saw the same shadows in others, in the way your neighbor stared too long at the fire, in the way your sister smiled without her eyes, in the way old men wept during prayers they couldn't finish. Everyone had their moment, the breaking. Some healed crooked, some didn't heal, but all stayed, because leaving wasn't escape. It was exchange, one prison for another. At least here, you knew the rules, the dangers, the silences. You knew when to step aside, when to bow, when to look away. You were fluent in fear. You taught it to your children without meaning to, in your tone, your gestures, your stories. You passed down more than recipes, more than songs. You passed down survival, and they would pass it too. You told yourself it wasn't so bad, that other places were worse, that at least there was food, sometimes, that at least the roof didn't leak, often, that at least your name hadn't been erased completely. Not yet. You told yourself it was okay. That life wasn't supposed to be joy, just work, just breath, just routine. You tried to believe it, because believing the alternative hurt more, because remembering what you lost made the ache too sharp. So you numbed. with chores, with prayers, with silence. And when you lay down at night, staring at the same ceiling, you didn't cry. You didn't smile. You just closed your eyes and waited. For sleep. For tomorrow. For the next repetition. And maybe, just maybe, in the soft dark, you whispered one final lie. That you were content. That it was enough. That you were okay. You didn't remember when your childhood ended. Maybe it never began. Maybe you were never allowed to have one. You were born, you were weighed, and then you were judged. Strong enough or not. Useful or not. A boy or a girl. A citizen or something less. If you cried too long or looked too frail, the midwife didn't comfort you, she paused. The elders didn't celebrate birth. They measured it. They examined your limbs like a butcher appraises a calf. If you passed, they let you live. If not, they didn't. And that wasn't tragedy. That was policy. That was Sparta. That was Athens. That was law. You didn't remember lullabies. You remembered commands. Sit. Eat. Be silent. Walk faster. Tarry more. Don't cry. Don't speak unless spoken to. Your mother didn't cradle you long. Not because she didn't love you, but because she couldn't afford to. Love was dangerous. It made farewells harder, and there were always farewells. At 7, you were no longer a child. You were a project. If you were a boy, in Sparta, they took you. The state took you. They stripped you, shaved you, starved you, hit you. They said it was training. They said it made you strong. You learned to steal food and not get caught. If you were caught, the punishment wasn't for theft. It was for failure. You learned to sleep on reeds, to fight with sticks, to suppress pain until it became indistinguishable from discipline. You didn't miss home. You forgot home. You weren't a son. You were a soldier. Not yet, but close. If you were in Athens, the education was different. Softer on the outside, but not kinder. You were taught poetry before compassion, debate before kindness, logic before empathy. Your tears were embarrassing. Your curiosity, a distraction. You were expected to learn, but only what was approved. Only what served the polis. Philosophy? Yes. Emotion? No. Unless you were a girl. Then you weren't expected to learn at all. You stayed in the home. You learned from your mother. Not letters, not numbers, but silence, obedience, clean hands and eyes lowered. You weren't allowed to go out alone. You weren't allowed to speak in assemblies. You weren't allowed to matter. Your value was your dowry, your future, a transaction. You belonged to your father until he sold you to a husband. You were currency, wrapped in soft skin and softer voice. And if you were a slave child, the rules were different again. Worse, you had no father, no dowry, no rights. You were a body in motion, expected to serve, to pour, to sweep, to carry, to shut up. You weren't trained, you were commanded. If you failed, you were struck. If you succeeded, you were ignored. You didn't learn why, just when. When to move, when to hide, when to flinch. You played games sometimes, but even games had rules that reminded you who you were. You raced, but there were no prizes. You threw stones, but never at the real enemy. You laughed, but always checking who was listening. Your friends were other shadows like you, other children who knew not to cry too loud, who knew bruises healed faster if you didn't touch them. You were told the gods watched over you, but only if you prayed, only if you obeyed, only if you bled correctly. You learned rituals before you learned joy, offerings before affection, sacrifices before choice. You didn't question why bulls died for rain. You just watched. You didn't ask if the gods cared about your pain. You assumed they didn't, because no one else did. You wanted to be good, not for moral reasons, but because being bad meant beatings, meant hunger, meant shame. You learned to self-police, to discipline your thoughts before anyone else did. You punished yourself in your mind to avoid punishment from others. You whispered your dreams into straw pillows, then forgot them by morning. You memorized verses from men you'd never meet. You recited them while your stomach growled. You didn't understand them. That wasn't the point. Recitation was obedience. Obedience was survival. You watched your siblings disappear into roles too big for them. One became a wife before she bled. One became a soldier before he kissed a girl. One vanished entirely. You never asked where. You learned not to. Your world was smaller than the map, but heavier than the sky. You knew the path from the well to the home better than your own reflection. You knew how to keep quiet in the presence of men. You knew how to pretend to pray. You knew how to breathe silently. You didn't dream of growing up. You feared it. You didn't want to become like the adults around you. Tired, bent, bitter. But you knew you would. That was the plan. That was the cycle. No one asked you what you wanted to be. You were told. You were assigned. You accepted. You didn't ask if others had it better. You knew they did. The men who rode horses, wore linen, spoke in measured tones. The boys who had tutors. The girls who had maids. The children whose feet didn't blister. You hated them, then envied them, then ignored them. That was easier. You were not supposed to rise. Just function. Just obey. Just survive. And you did. Not because you were strong, but because you were afraid. Because fear was the first language you ever learned, and the one you never forgot. You thought growing up would bring freedom. That once you were no longer a child, you'd finally choose your path. But no one told you that adulthood wasn't a door, it was a trapdoor. You didn't step into liberty. You fell into obligation, into debt, into expectation. Your body was no longer your own. It belonged to the polis, to your family, to the gods, to war. If you were a man, you were expected to fight. It wasn't a question. It was a requirement. The city raised you not to think, but to obey. You picked up a shield long before you learned how to rest. You trained for battles you didn't choose, fought enemies you didn't know. You bled for leaders who would never learn your name. They told you it was glory, but it felt like mud, like hunger, like the weight of your friend dying beside you and still being told to push forward. You weren't taught to grieve. Grief was weakness, so you buried it, deep, until it rotted inside you, until you couldn't remember who you were before the war. And there was always another war. If not with neighbors, then with your own people. If not with weapons, then with laws. You returned from battle expecting rest. You got taxes. You got scrutiny. You got silence. If you hesitated in war, they questioned your courage. If you hesitated in peace, they questioned your loyalty. Every step watched. Every word judged. You weren't a man. You were a citizen, which meant you were owned. And if you were a woman, you were owned from the start. Adulthood didn't bring agency. It brought further isolation. You left your father's home for your husband's. A new cage. Same bars. You didn't choose who you married. He did. Your father did. The priest did. The gods did. Everyone but you. You moved into a home where your name faded, where your opinions were unwelcome, where you became a vessel for heirs, for honor, for silence. You were expected to run the household, to bear sons, to vanish in public. If you spoke too loudly, they called you disrespectful. If you didn't speak, they called you dull. There was no right way to exist, only acceptable ways to vanish. Your worth was in your womb, and once that failed, or if it never worked, you were a burden, a reminder of failure, a thing to be pitied or scorned. If you were a slave, adulthood was more of the same. More orders, more bruises, more reminders that your life was not your own. You could be sold at any time. Your children taken. Your body used. Your complaints ignored. You didn't age into respect. You aged into deeper servitude, into harder work, into fading eyesight and aching limbs and the constant knowledge that nothing you did would ever free you. You prayed, but not for justice. That was too big. You prayed for small mercies, for your master to look the other way, for the overseer to forget your name, for 1 extra hour of sleep, for the food to be warm, for your child to be spared. Sometimes the gods listened. Mostly, they didn't. You began to doubt they were even there, or that they ever cared. But you didn't say that out loud. Blasphemy was punished, sometimes by exile, sometimes by death. You watched men forced to drink poison for words. You learned to keep yours trapped behind your teeth. You watched your neighbors grow sick. There were no hospitals, only herbs and hope. No one came to help. The polis was not a caregiver. It was a judge. It didn't see illness, only weakness. If you couldn't work, you were useless. If you were useless, you were discarded. You watched the old die quietly, not honored, forgotten, their wisdom ignored, their stories lost. You realized you were becoming one of them. Slowly, quietly. You worked every day until your back screamed. But the city never said thank you. It expected more. You were always behind, always lacking, always indebted. Even if you gave everything, it wasn't enough. They said it was your duty, that the good of the polis was greater than the good of the self. But the polis never shared its wealth, never gave you rest, never asked what you needed. You weren't a citizen. You were fuel. For armies, for temples, for streets you didn't walk, for statues that didn't resemble you. You thought maybe if you did everything right, they'd see you. They didn't. You thought maybe if you were strong enough, kind enough, obedient enough, you'd matter. You didn't. You were praised only when dead. And even then, only if your life had served their narrative. You watched the festivals from a distance. Music you couldn't dance to. Wine you didn't drink. Laughter that felt like mockery. You wondered how many others felt the same. How many stood beside you in silence. How many smiled through the ache. How many whispered to themselves at night, trying to remember a reason to keep going. You clung to your family, if you had one, to small joys, a shared meal, a kind glance, a moment of stillness. But even those were rare and fleeting. The weight never left your chest. The fear never left your belly. The feeling that you could lose everything with one wrong look, one wrong word, one storm, one war, one tax. You thought adulthood would be the summit. It was another valley. You thought age would bring clarity. It brought exhaustion. You thought you'd finally become someone. But instead, you became no one. You forgot when you stopped referring to yourself by name. You just became the thing you did. The mother, the craftsman, the servant, the soldier, the body that worked, the mouth that stayed shut, the back that carried. No one asked who you were anymore. They asked what you provided. You answered in tasks. You answered in duty. You answered in silence. You were no longer a person. You were a piece of something else. The city, the family, the temple, a cog without design, a tool without sharpness, a life without shape. You walked streets that never said your name. You passed people who didn't see you. You nodded, bowed, obeyed. Every gesture choreographed. Every step calculated. Not to offend, not to stand out, not to matter. You learned that being seen was dangerous. Being noticed meant questions, attention, scrutiny, punishment. Better to be invisible. Better to fold into the walls. Better to breathe quietly than to breathe freely. You did not sing. You did not dance unless told to. You did not laugh unless permitted. You did not weep unless alone. Emotion was indulgence. Identity was vanity. You were told humility was virtue. What they meant was erasure. What they wanted was submission. You watched the statues, tall and perfect, carved in marble and praised for eternity. You wondered who they used to be. Did they have names? Did they smile once? Did they ever wish to run? Were they happier as stone? You thought maybe you would be. Still, frozen, finally admired for being silent enough. You remembered stories of heroes, Achilles, Odysseus, but you knew those were myths. They had choices. You didn't. They had gods watching. You had taxes. They had battles for love. You had markets and sewage. They defied fate. You were crushed by it. You remembered being young and dreaming of travel, of going to Delphi, to Crete, to the far edges of the Aegean. But now the idea made you tired. Who would feed the animals? Who would clean the floor? Who would carry water? Who would care that you were gone? No one. That's who. Even your absence would go unnoticed. A day would pass. A week, then someone else would take your place. Someone always did. You thought of the gods and how they never aged. How they watched from the clouds and demanded sacrifice. How they needed your devotion but never gave back. You wondered if they were lonely. Then you laughed, silently. They weren't real enough to feel lonely, but you were. You were surrounded by people, and still alone. You heard voices, but none for you. You saw hands, but none reaching out. You wanted to scream, but even that required energy. You didn't have energy. Only routine. Only repetition. Only the same steps on the same dirt. Your hands were calloused. Your back hurt. Your mind whispered in quiet corners, but no one listened. No one asked. You told yourself this was life. This was adulthood. This was what came after youth. But sometimes in the pause before sleep, you remembered something else. A moment, a scent, a sound, someone calling your name. Not your role, not your task, your name. It felt like a dream, a kindness you didn't deserve. You buried it quickly. Dreams were crueler than chores. At least chores were real. You looked in puddles and saw nothing. Not a face, a shape, not a spark, a shadow. You avoided mirrors. You avoided memories. You survived by forgetting who you were, what you wanted, what you feared, what you loved. You survived by becoming hollow. Because hollow things don't break, they echo. That was enough. That had to be enough. You prayed out of habit, not hope. You moved out of need, not desire. You waited not for change, but for the end. You watched younger people and envied their ignorance, their hope. You wanted to shake it out of them, or protect it, or both. You didn't know. You only knew you didn't want them to become like you. But they would. The system ensured it. The rituals rehearsed it. The festivals masked it. The philosophers debated it, but never fixed it. You heard their words in the agora. Socrates, Plato, big thoughts, big words. Nothing changed. Nothing helped. They talked of virtue. You needed bread. They talked of justice. You needed rest. They talked of souls. You were losing yours, piece by piece, day by day. No one stole it. You gave it up to survive. You let yourself be emptied so that others could feel full, so that the world could keep turning. You told yourself that was noble, that was duty, but it still hurt. It still stung. Even now, even after all these years, you were no longer angry. Anger took shape. Anger had fire. You had ash. You had echoes. You had memory. Thin, brittle memory of a time when your voice was louder, your body lighter, your name yours. But now, you were quiet, heavy, vanishing. You walked slower, spoke less, slept more. Each breath a little thinner, each day a little dimmer. You didn't expect anyone to notice. You didn't want them to. You just wanted peace, not triumph, not legacy, just stillness, quiet, a moment where no one needed you, no one ordered you, no one forgot you. You closed your eyes often now, longer each time, not in sleep, in pause, in small rehearsals for something final. You didn't fear death, you feared more life. Life like this, life where you weren't even a name, just a shadow. They told you it was the golden age, that your city was the heart of the world, that its thinkers were the wisest, its theaters the most grand, its democracy the most just. But your feet still bled on the stones, your hands still cracked in winter, your stomach still growled. You were told this was greatness, yet it never fed you, never comforted you, never saw you. They erected marble temples to gods that never answered. They etched laws into stone that never protected. They sang odes to honor, but only for the few. The men with land. The men with names. The men who had never carried a bucket of sewage uphill in the rain. You worked while they debated virtue. You carried while they sculpted ideals. You aged while they painted youth. You stood in the back while they took the stage. The democracy they praised did not speak your language. Its tongue did not bend for slaves, or women, or foreigners. You were expected to listen, not to speak, to serve, not to rule, to cheer, not to vote. You watched the assemblies from shadows. You heard the votes, but never cast one. You saw decisions made for you, not with you. And if you protested, you were punished, ostracized, silenced, made an example. Freedom, you learned, was not a gift. It was a weapon, held by those who already had power, wielded against those who didn't. They called it equality. You called it theater. You cleaned their homes. You raised their children. You prepared their sacrifices. You dressed their wives. You buried their dead. You were part of everything, and yet, you were part of nothing. They walked past you like wind. They addressed you like stone. If they remembered your name, it was only to command. If they touched your shoulder, it was only to steer. If they looked in your eyes, it was only to test obedience. You learned not to look back. You learned not to expect. The poets wrote about love, about heroism, about honor. But none of their verses were for you. You didn't inspire. You endured. You didn't win battles. You scrubbed the blood. You didn't fall in love. You were sold into marriage, or taken in the night, or left behind. The marketplace overflowed with olive, oil, fish, figs, but you could barely afford barley. The vendors shouted prices that rose with the sun. You waited for dusk, for leftovers, for scraps. You saw coins pass hands like blessings, but yours stayed hidden, counted, feared. The festivals came, loud and blinding, processions of wine and gods and music. But joy was not yours. You watched from alleys. You cleaned after feasts. You bent to pick up crumbs while others danced. You envied their abandon. You feared their gaze. For in joy, they became careless. In celebration, cruel. You knew that laughter could turn, that wine could rot into rage. You stayed small. You stayed still. The philosophers filled the air with questions. What is virtue? What is justice? What is the good life? You had your answers. You had lived them. Virtue was obedience. Justice was illusion. The good life was someone else's. They never asked you. They never listened. They built statues of men who never lifted a shovel. They named streets after generals who never knew hunger. They taught children to aspire, never to see. The city grew, but so did the shadows. Behind every column, a story untold. Behind every triumph, 100 quiet losses. You saw it. You carried it. You were it. You heard the historians speak of progress, of greatness, But progress never knocked on your door. Greatness never carried your buckets. The polis demanded sacrifice. You gave. The polis demanded loyalty. You obeyed. The polis demanded silence. You complied. But when you needed food, care, peace, it looked away. You were not the subject of history. You were its cost, its foundation, its fuel. You saw young boys taught to dream. You saw young girls taught to disappear. You saw neighbors vanish in debt, in plague, in war. You saw priests hold more power than healers. You saw oracles feared more than mothers. You saw the city rise, but not for you. You lived in its gutters, its alleys, its sweat, its blood. You were its bones, but never its face. You didn't dream of escape. You dreamed of breath, one without weight, without demand. You dreamed of a day where you weren't reminded you were less. You dreamed of quiet, of time, of your name spoken softly. But dreams were currency you couldn't afford. They didn't fill bowls. They didn't mend sandals. So you let them die, like the hope before them. And still the city said, be grateful. Still they told you, this is glory. Still they claimed, this is the pinnacle. You looked at the skyline temples, statues, fire, and felt nothing. Just the ache in your back, the chill in your bones, the truth in your silence. You were not part of a golden age. You were trapped in a golden cage. And no one ever handed you the key. They said philosophy was the light of the Greeks, that it lifted man from darkness, that it questioned everything, but not everything, never everything. The questions had limits. They asked what made a good life, but only for men like them. They asked what was just, but only from marble steps. They asked what was virtue, but never while scrubbing blood from sandals. They debated courage in the comfort of colonnades. They spoke of moderation with tables full of figs. They discussed slavery, but never as slaves. They discussed the soul, but never saw yours. Your thoughts were never invited. Your fears were not relevant. Your hunger not academic. You listened to Socrates speak of truth, but truth did not feed you. You heard Plato dream of ideal forms, but ideals did not warm you. You watched students of Aristotle sketch stars, but the heavens were not your shelter. The ground was cold and hard. You learned quickly that knowledge had a gate, and you didn't have the key. The academy was not built for you. It had steps you weren't meant to climb. You were told, some are born to learn, others to serve. That was the wisdom they never questioned. That was the truth they never doubted. The very foundation of their reason was hierarchy. And you were at the bottom. They said logos ruled all things, but your world was ruled by weight. Of water jars, of wheat sacks, of silent burdens. Logic didn't lessen it. Rhetoric didn't lift it. They admired symmetry. But your world was lopsided. They prized reason. But reason did not explain your suffering, only justified it. They taught boys to speak with elegance, to argue with flair, to move crowds with syllogisms. But your words were plain, rough, tired. No one wanted your speech, only your labor, your obedience, your stillness. They glorified the mind, but punished the body, except when it served their games, their wars, their pleasure. Your body wasn't yours. It was borrowed, claimed, used, discarded. They said everything had a purpose, that every man had a nature. Yours, apparently, was to suffer, quietly, to break, invisibly, to disappear, completely. The myths told you gods walked among men, that Zeus judged, Athena guided, Apollo healed. But the gods never came to your street. They didn't see your child cough through the night. They didn't help you find firewood. They didn't hold you when everything hurt. Their temples stood tall, yes, But you weren't welcome inside. Not truly. You brought offerings, but never received blessings. You lit candles, but never felt warmth. The priests spoke on your behalf, but they never heard your voice. You learned religion was a performance, a transaction, not a comfort, not a refuge, not a truth. You saw statues of gods with perfect muscles, perfect features. They looked nothing like you. You were bent, bruised, burned. You prayed, but mostly out of fear. Fear of disease, fear of drought, fear of punishment. They said the gods punished arrogance, but the powerful were never punished. Only you. You were punished for hunger, for love, for speaking, for bleeding, for dreaming, for asking. You were told that suffering was noble, that enduring made you virtuous, that pain was part of life. But whose life? Whose virtue? You saw the same faces suffer, the same hands crack, the same backs bend. It wasn't fate, it was design. And they called it divine. The schools taught that reason separated man from beast. But reason never helped you. Instinct did. Memory did. You remembered the times you spoke out and were beaten. You remembered the days you begged and were ignored. You remembered to stay low, to stay quiet, to stay invisible. That was wisdom. Real wisdom. Not in scrolls. In scars. You watched teachers train sons of senators. How to lead. How to command. How to conquer. But no one taught you how to live. How to hope. How to feel. Those were not part of the curriculum. Your education was pain. Your classroom was the street. Your diploma was silence. You saw how beauty was worshipped. Symmetry. Youth. Skin untouched by labor. They built art to honor it. But you had no time for beauty. You had no space for art. Your beauty was survival. Your creation was another day. They didn't call that sacred. They didn't carve that in marble. You watched comedies where your pain was mocked, tragedies where your story was told then forgotten. The stage gave your suffering a script. The audience gave it applause. But when the curtain fell, nothing changed. You walked home the same, only now, reminded that your pain was entertainment, that your struggle was spectacle, that even your misery was stolen. You learned the lie of enlightenment, that it was not for you, that your darkness was not something to banish but something to bear, quietly. Alone, you wondered what would happen if you spoke your truth. If you stood in the agora and screamed. But who would hear? Who would care? You were not the speaker. You were the stone he stood on, the shadow behind him, the dust underfoot. They would not see you. They never did. They never wanted to. They feared your truth, because it cracked the illusion of wisdom, of fairness, of light. So they taught their children not to look at you, not to listen, not to ask. And they didn't. You faded, day by day, word by word, until only your work remained. And when that too was gone, you vanished, not with a sound, but with a whisper. They praised the mind, but forgot the heart. They sculpted ideals, but never asked what they cost. You walked through streets lined with marble. You passed columns that cast long shadows, and in those shadows you lived. You cleaned the dust from their libraries, but could not read. You watched their students debate the soul, but no one asked about yours. You were never the philosopher, only the silence they filled with their voices. You were never the thinker, only the surface they stood on to reach the stars. They said the city was an idea, that it existed in thought as much as in stone, but no one asked what it felt like. To be the hands that laid those stones, to be the back bent under those ideas. You did not breathe philosophy. You choked on it. It filled every space, every wall, every temple, but it never offered peace, only posture. They taught boys that strength was reason, that emotion was weakness, that tears had no place in wisdom. And so they raised men who couldn't weep, who couldn't touch, who couldn't heal. Men who conquered cities, but never their fear. Men who wrote verses, but couldn't hold their sons. You watched those men lead armies, start wars, pull impious, but never sit still, never hold stillness. You saw them admire beauty in statues, but destroy it in people. They desired perfection, but feared mess. And you were mess. You were life, unsculpted. You were hunger, unpoetic. You were pain, untheorized. You were real. And they never forgave that. They taught that silence was noble, that restraint was power. But you saw the harm it caused. The sons who never spoke to fathers, the wives who never spoke of sorrow, the slaves who never spoke at all. The city praised stoicism, but it bled inward. People smiled and broke, laughed and fractured, danced and drowned. No one asked, no one knew, no one dared. The mind was Eve, writhing, they said. The body, a vessel. But your body was never listened to. It screamed, it shook, it ached, it signaled, but they ignored it, or controlled it, or punished it. They called pleasure suspect, desire dangerous, rest indulgent. But you had none of those luxuries. You didn't choose restraint. It was forced. You didn't choose temperance. It was lack. They said, know thyself, but never showed how. Never taught the tools. They believed introspection was privilege, and you were never granted it. You were too busy surviving, too busy obeying, too busy hiding. They built schools, but not shelters. They built theaters, but not hospitals. They built altars, but not arms. You walked past them daily, past statues of gods and men and heroes. You never saw yourself in them. Your face, your scars, your story. They weren't built for you. They were built to remind you who mattered, who didn't. You were background. You were soil. You were necessary, but not seen. Wanted, but not welcomed. Needed, but never named. Even their myths betrayed you. You heard tales of women turned to monsters, of slaves who died for honor, of strangers punished for truth. You learned early, don't be too curious. Don't be too bold. Don't speak when it's not your turn. Don't love who you're not allowed. The myths were not escape. They were warning. And still, the city called it enlightenment. Still, the city told the world it was the pinnacle. And maybe in marble it was, but not in flesh, not in breath, not in the quiet corners where real people lived and died and were forgotten. You felt the weight of that forgetfulness. Every day, every task, every dismissal. You weren't a character. You weren't a lesson. You were a laborer, a survivor, a shadow. You were taught that your place was small, that humility was virtue, that invisibility was grace. But humility didn't warm you. Invisibility didn't save you. Grace didn't hold your hand. You longed to be seen, not by gods, not by philosophers, but by someone, anyone, who looked and said, you are here, you matter, you are more than use. But that voice never came. That gaze never met yours. And so you moved through life as an echo, as a footprint, as a smudge on stone. They built a civilization on top of you. They wrote their names in your silence. They declared victory with your breath. And you kept walking, kept carrying, kept bending, until even you forgot your shape, until you no longer asked what it could mean to be whole. That question was for others, for the thinkers, for the writers, for the ones who never cleaned latrines, or held dying children, or buried strangers without names. You were not them, and they were not you. And the city made sure it stayed that way. So you folded your hopes. You stored your questions. You sealed your sorrow. You kept going. Because that's what you knew. That's what they taught you. That's what they needed. You to keep going. Even if you were breaking. Even if you were gone. The olive groves whispered, but not of peace. They whispered of labor, of bent backs, of mornings before light, of nights without dreams. You woke not to songbirds, but to the creak of old wood, the groan of joints, the hunger in your gut. The village was not a place of quiet joy. It was a place of dust, of sweat, of routine. The same path to the well, the same stones underfoot, the same ache behind your eyes. No statues stood here. No philosophers came here. The gods passed over this place, left it to rot. The fields gave little. The soil was thin. The rain, fickle. The sun, unrelenting. Crops failed more often than not. And still, you worked. Because there was nothing else. No trade, no learning, no hope of escape. Your world was this patch of land, this hut, this hunger. You learned early not to expect more. You watched your parents waste away, slowly, not from illness, but from effort, from years of bending and lifting and digging and scraping, from carrying water farther than was ever fair. You learned that children were not blessings, but necessities. More hands, more help, more mouths, yes, but also more work. You were not cherished. You were used, gently, sometimes, but used. The animals fared better. The goats were fed before you. The donkey had shelter when you did not. You grew up quick, not from wisdom, but from want. Your play was brief, your laughter suspicious. You learned that smiling made you soft, that hope made you careless. So, you let go of both. You took your place in the line. The endless cycle. Wake, work, worry, wait. The seasons passed, but they brought no joy. Summer burned you. Winter froze you. Autumn meant failed harvests. Spring meant starting again with less. You did not celebrate the solstice. You didn't know the date. You only knew how long the day felt, how short the food lasted. You knew the names of plants because you had to. You knew which roots to chew when your stomach twisted, which leaves could help a fever. You were not trained. You remembered through pain. Your body kept the lessons your parents' mouths were too tired to say. Language failed, but memory held. You remembered how your brother died. You remembered how your mother wept. You remembered the silence after. How no one said his name. How grief became a chore. You learned to carry it like water, unspillable. You watched marriages formed from need, not love. Dowries mattered more than dreams. Your sister was sent to a man, twice her age. She cried the night before. Your father looked away. Your mother said nothing. That was the way. Love was a luxury. Marriage was a transaction. Children were the receipt. No one asked how you felt. That wasn't a question people had here. Feelings didn't plant wheat. Emotions didn't patch roofs. So you buried yours, deep, like seeds that would never sprout. You feared illness, not because of pain, but because of helplessness. A single fever could end you. No medicine, no healer, only guesswork, only prayers. Only watching someone grow quiet and still and cold. You watched it too many times. You didn't cry anymore. Not really. Not like you used to. The tears felt wasteful. Like water spilled on dry earth. They never soaked in. They never changed anything. You feared fire. Not because it destroyed, but because it came quickly and there was no saving anything. You feared bandits because the city didn't protect you. The guards didn't patrol this far. You were on your own. If someone took from you, there was no justice. Only loss. Only rage. Only silence. You feared the taxman, because he always came. No matter how little you had, you gave because you had no choice. And when you had nothing, you hid. But they found something. They always did. They took goats, grain, tools, dignity. You watched neighbors disappear. Some to debt, some to slavery, some to shame. You wondered if they were better off, if not knowing was kinder. You watched the temple priest walk through once a month. He never looked you in the eye. He spoke of the gods, but his hands were clean, his robe too fine, his shoes unscuffed. He didn't know your God. Your God was the ache in your legs, the buzz of a fly near your eye, the sting of wind through a broken roof. Your God didn't demand prayer, only survival, only breath, only another step. You gave offerings when you could, bread, oil, a flower. You didn't know if it mattered, but it felt like something, like reaching. Even if no one reached back, you learned that silence was a skill, that talking too much brought danger, that asking questions marked you, that hoping aloud cursed you. So you kept your mouth shut. You kept your head low. You kept moving. Always. You wondered, sometimes, if the city was real, if Athens was as grand as they said, if people there bathed daily, if they knew music, if they spoke of stars. You tried to imagine it, but the thoughts slipped away, like a dream half remembered. It didn't belong to you. It belonged to someone with time, with rest, with clean hands. Not you. Never you. Your life was this, always this. A loop, a cycle, a burden passed from back to back. You didn't live. You continued. You existed. And that was enough. That had to be enough. You were told that to live simply was a virtue. But there was no choice in your simplicity. You didn't renounce luxury, you never saw it. You didn't seek stillness, it was imposed. You didn't embrace nature, you were trapped in it. The wind wasn't poetic. It tore at your walls. The rain didn't cleanse. It leaked through the roof. The sun didn't nourish. It cracked your skin. The stars weren't wonder. They were cold. They were reminders of distance, of how small you were, how unseen. You didn't name constellations. You counted animals. You didn't chart the moon. You tracked planting seasons. Not for curiosity, for survival, for food. You watched the sky only to pray it wouldn't betray you again. Because it did. Often. Without warning. Droughts came. Floods followed. Pests swarmed. You had no recourse. No aid. The gods were distant. The state more so. Your only tools were your hands. Your only hope. Endurance. You learned to make do. To fix the same shoe 3 times. To patch the same cloak 5. To use every bit of bone, hide, wood. Nothing wasted. Because everything cost something. Not money, effort. Energy you didn't have. Time you couldn't spare. You wore the same clothes for years. You washed in cold streams. You slept on straw, not by choice, by necessity. You didn't complain. There was no audience, no relief. Only ears that were just as tired, just as full of their own hunger. You understood pain not as event, but as constant. A background hum. Your joints, your teeth, your eyes. Always something. Always some little ache. You didn't seek cures. You couldn't afford the cost of rest. So you worked, through fever, through cramps, through bleeding. You limped. You tightened belts. You said nothing. You endured. Not for nobility, but for necessity. For lack of options. For the people beside you who depended on you. For the hope, faint and distant, that tomorrow might hurt less. You saw others fall. Sometimes from age. Sometimes from accidents. Sometimes from giving up. You learned the look in their eyes. before they stopped rising from their beds, before they stopped caring for the fire. You recognized it, you feared it, you buried it. You couldn't afford to carry others' despair. Your arms were already full. You became efficient, not clever efficient. You learned shortcuts, not to save time but to spare energy. You learned when to speak, when to nod, when to vanish. You learned silence better than speech, because it cost less, drew less, risked less. You watched visitors pass through, tax collectors, soldiers, traders. You saw the difference in their posture, the weightlessness in their eyes. They looked at you like you were a thing, like a rock, a plant, a fixture. They didn't speak your name. You doubted they knew it. They spoke of cities, of roads, of ports. None of it meant anything. None of it touched you. You were beneath their map, outside their plan. You were not a citizen. You were fuel. Your body fed their numbers. Your work fed their ledgers. Your suffering fed their myth of greatness. You thought sometimes of leaving. But where? To what? You had no coin, no friend beyond the hills. You couldn't read a sign, couldn't ride a horse, couldn't imagine another sky. So you stayed, because fear was a wall, and hope a distant whisper. You poured yourself into routine. You let the rhythm replace the yearning. Chop, stack, milk, steer, sow, carry, kneel, sleep. You let your body take over. Let it remember what your mind had abandoned. You stopped asking, stopped dreaming, stopped wondering. That was for others, for poets, for wanderers. You were not them. You were roots, buried, supporting, invisible. You watched your children mirror you, not because you taught them, but because they watched, they listened. They saw your shoulders, your silences. They mimicked your resignation. You wanted more for them, but you had no name for it, no model, no map. You couldn't teach what you never saw. You hoped the gods were kind. That was all. That was it. That was the extent of your rebellion. Hope, small, fragile, tucked away where no one could mock it, where even you could forget it until you needed it. You aged fast, not in years but in wear. Your hair grayed early, your bones stiffened. You laughed less, slept lighter, dreamed quieter. You stopped counting seasons. They blurred. You remembered time not in dates, but in losses. When the cow died, when the roof collapsed, when the fever came, when the baby didn't make it. Those were your markers, your history, your calendar. You didn't ask for joy, only for less pain, only for less fear, only for enough bread, enough peace, enough warmth. You didn't pray for greatness, only rest. Just once, a day without worry, a night without dread, a breath that didn't carry weight. It rarely came, and when it did, you didn't trust it. You waited for it to break, because it always did, and still you kept going, because that's what you knew. That's what the land taught you. That's what the silence shaped you into. Not a hero, not a thinker, not a leader, just someone who continued, who remained, who bore witness, who refused, quietly, to vanish. You were not remembered. No one wrote your name. No scribe etched your deeds. No poet sang your love. You passed through the world like a shadow between walls felt, perhaps for a moment, but never truly seen. Your hands left prints, yes, but the wind took them, the rain washed them, time unmade them. You did not leave a legacy. You left absence, and still you were real. You breathed. You bled. You prayed. You existed. You mattered if only to yourself, and sometimes that was all. The others around you were the same, silent, bent, weathered. The elderly woman with a twisted spine, the man with a missing leg, the boy who never spoke. You knew them not by names, but by rhythm, by presence, by their way of walking, or coughing, or sitting in the sun. You shared space, breath, dust, not stories. There was little room for stories. They took time. They took peace. You had neither. So you carried each other in glances, in habits, in the small acts that meant nothing in everything. A shared crust of bread, a blanket offered, a bucket lifted. Love was not declared. It was practiced, wordlessly, tirelessly, sometimes thanklessly. You buried your dead in silence. There was no ceremony, no eulogy, only dirt, only hands, only eyes refusing to cry because the tears would not bring grain. You remembered them as you remembered your own pain, intermittently, when silence was too loud to avoid. Grief came in stillness, in the moments between chores, when your fingers paused and memory slipped in, unwanted, uninvited, undeniable. You learned not to fight it. You let it wash through, like rain, like smoke, like time. You didn't teach your children about hope. You taught them how to mend, how to carry, how to hide. You told them where the snakes nested, where the wind broke strongest, how to hold their tongue before the wrong man. Survival was your legacy, and survival was enough. You told yourself that, over and over, because what else was there? You watched as your skin lost color, as your joints stiffened, as your teeth ached in your jaw. You noticed when your steps slowed, when your breath caught, when your mornings came with more silence than before. You accepted it, not gladly, not with wisdom, just with inevitability, like winter, like dust, like nightfall. You made peace, if not with your life, then with its shape, with its repetition, with its weight. You did not need meaning. You needed rest. You didn't seek understanding. You sought warmth. You sat near the fire. You watched it move. You felt the pull of it, the hum, the heat. It didn't judge. It didn't ask. It simply was. And so were you. You let your thoughts drift, sometimes, to the hills beyond, to the cities you never saw. You didn't dream of wealth, or love, or power. You dreamed of ease, of waking without pain, of walking without purpose, of lying down without fear. You dreamed of not dreaming, and still, part of you whispered that maybe you were wrong. Maybe there was more, somewhere, elsewhere, beyond. But you did not chase it. You didn't have the strength. And maybe that was its mercy, to know your limits, to live within them, to stretch only as far as your bones allowed. You watched the seasons pass, and you counted them not as victories, but as continuations. One more, one more, one more, until there were no more. You left your days behind like worn sandals, like chipped bowls, useful once, familiar, and then gone. The children carried on. They built from what you left, or didn't. It was not your concern. Your story was done. If it was ever a story, if it was ever more than a flicker in the wind. But you were here, once. That mattered. Even if no one remembered, even if no one carved it in stone, the stones had their own memory. The dust knew your shape, the wind, your scent, the soil, your blood. That was enough. That had to be enough. You were born unwanted, not hated, just inconvenient. A daughter meant dowry, meant cost, meant no help in the fields. So your birth was met not with songs but silence, a tight smile, a sigh. They let you live. That was your first mercy. Others like you were not so lucky. You grew in a room, always a room. Your world was walls, small, contained. Safe, they said. But safety was a synonym for control, for limits, for stillness. You learned not to run, not to shout, not to explore. Your steps were quieted, your voice softened, your eyes lowered. You were taught early what not to be. Not loud, not visible, not defiant, not curious. Your body was not yours. It belonged to the household, to the future husband you hadn't met, to the children you were expected to carry. You were a vessel, a function, a bridge between generations, but never a self. You played with dolls, not for fun, but for rehearsal. You dressed them, rocked them, married them, buried them, practicing for your own roles. You helped your mother. You watched your father from afar. He spoke loudly, moved freely, ate first, sat centered. You served. You waited. You disappeared. They didn't ask your opinion. You didn't know you had one. You learned to read faces, not books. To read moods, not maps. Your education was survival. How to avoid punishment. How to endure shame. How to navigate a world where you were always second, or third, or last. You bled for the first time. You were told you were a woman now, but you felt smaller, not older. You were hidden more, watched more, touched more, without asking, without warning, without kindness. Your body changed, became a problem, a temptation, a threat. You learned to fold yourself, to shrink, to vanish. Marriage came early. You didn't choose him. You were chosen, bargained, positioned. One man to another, like cattle, like land, like debt. He didn't love you. That wasn't expected. He wanted heirs, loyalty, obedience. You gave what you could. You bled again and again. Sometimes with birth, sometimes with loss, sometimes alone, sometimes watched by midwives who spoke of you like furniture. The pain was yours alone, the silence too. You learned the names of herbs, of shadows, of fears. You learned to soothe children, and men, and mothers-in-law, everyone but yourself. You had no time. You had no space. You bled into rags and into soil and into silence, and no one wrote it down. You were not a myth. You were not a muse. You were not a goddess. You were the woman behind the loom, behind the door, behind the veil. You worked from dawn to dusk, spinning, stirring, sewing, cleaning, nursing, kneading, grinding, always moving, always needed, never thanked. Your rest was sleep, not peace. Your dreams, if the A came, were echoes of chores, of cries, of footsteps. You envied the man not for power but for air, for movement, for unobserved moments. They went to market, to assembly, to war. You stayed, always stayed, with walls, with fire, with duty. Your daughters repeated you, your sons forgot you, and still you persisted, because there was no alternative, because life did not ask if you wanted it. It simply arrived, demanded, continued. You found moments, small ones, a song hummed while baking, a glance from another woman, a quiet smile from a child. They sustained you, briefly. You clung to them like rope, like light. You whispered stories to yourself, not aloud, just inside. Tiny rebellions, secret truths. You imagined a world with doors, with names, with paths. You knew it wouldn't come, but you carried it, inside, like a hidden ember, never fed, never lit, but warm, barely. You aged early. The work did that. The worry, the waiting. Your hands cracked, your back bent, your eyes dulled, but you kept moving, because stillness felt like death, because to stop was to vanish. You watched younger girls begin the same cycle. You ached for them, and you helped them, quietly, with advice, with warning, with presence. You became the woman others leaned on, the silent strength, the unmarked cornerstone. You buried friends, children, husbands. You did not cry publicly. That was not your place. You keened in kitchens, in gardens, in corners. You let the grief pass like wind. You stayed rooted. Because that's what women did. They remained. They endured. You were not history, but you were its frame, its breath, its cost. And in that, perhaps, was power. Not glory, not legacy, but truth. You mattered. Even if they didn't know. Even if they didn't say, you held the world while it ignored you. You were the silence that made space for sound, the shadow that made the light visible. And that, in the end, was not small. You had no name, not truly. You were called something, yes, but it wasn't yours. It was given, assigned, like a label, like a mark on a pot. You didn't answer with pride. You answered to avoid pain. Your name was utility. You had no origin, no remembered home, no motherland, just fragments, a color of soil, the curve of a tree, a scent, all fading, all stolen. You were taken young. You don't remember how old. Old enough to understand the fear. Too young to resist. You were sold, inspected, measured, shown, like cattle, like goods. They didn't ask who you were, only what you could do. Could you lift? Could you clean? Could you bear? Could you obey? That was the extent of your value. Not dreams, not thoughts, not hope, just function. They touched you without asking, stripped you without shame. You learned early that your body was not yours, that pain was currency, that silence was safety, that eye contact was danger. You slept in corners, ate what was left. You were always tired, always watching, always bracing. You moved quietly, spoke less. You became a shadow, a background hum. That was survival. You served, in fields, in homes, in mines. Each place had its own cruelty. The field broke your back, the mine your lungs, the house your soul. In the house, you had to smile, bow, perform, pretend. In the mine, you screamed in silence. In the field, you dissolved under the sun. No one saw you. Not really. They saw a task completed, a dish washed, a floor swept, a cart pulled. But not you. Never you. You weren't supposed to be seen. Not as human. Only as helpful. You didn't resist. There was nowhere to go. The roads weren't yours. The laws weren't yours. The land, the language, the breath, it all belonged to others. You prayed, at first, to your gods, then theirs, then to no one. Prayers stopped making sense. Who listens to property? Who answers a tool? So you stopped asking. You learned to endure, to break slowly, to crack in quiet places. You counted days not by names, but by pain. Bruises, cuts, shouts. They were your calendar, your measure. You heard people speak of freedom, as if it were a gift, as if it were possible. You stopped listening. It hurt too much. The word had no taste, no weight. It floated, mocked. You knew one thing: obedience. Not loyalty, not respect, just the calculation of consequence. You learned who hit, who watched, who whispered. You adjusted. You adapted. That was survival. You watched others die. From beatings, from work, from grief. No one mourned them. There was no ceremony, no name spoken. Just silence. Just continuation. The gap they left was filled by another body, Another shadow. Another back bent. You didn't cry for them. You couldn't. Tears were dangerous. They showed softness. Softness invited more pain, so you hardened. You didn't die exactly. You disappeared, piece by piece, year by year, until only routine remained. You laughed once. You don't remember why or when, but it hurt. It echoed. It felt like betrayal, like memory, like something you shouldn't have kept. You were punished, once for speaking. You never did again, not unless asked, and even then briefly. You were taught to be invisible, and you succeeded. So well that even you forgot you were real. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, when a breeze touched your skin, when a bird called your name your true name, the one you'd forgotten, when a child smiled at you without fear, and in those moments you felt the echo of self, of before, of something that mattered. You never held it long. It passed, like smoke, like wind, like songs you once knew, but it reminded you, you existed. Even if they said you didn't, even if they tried to erase it, you were. And that was a rebellion, a quiet one, a hidden one, but real. You lived without rest, without choice, without dignity, and yet you lived. You kept breathing. You moved forward. You carried others. You carried yourself when no one else would. You died one day. They didn't mark it, didn't speak it. You became dust, like everyone else. And in that, you were equal. Finally. Not a slave, not a tool. Just bone, just memory, just truth. The ground didn't care who you were, only that you returned. And it welcomed you, silently, as its own. You were born beneath stone, not in a palace, not in a clean room, in the back of a hut with a dirt floor and thin walls that whispered with every wind. Your father didn't speak much. Your mother worked constantly. You didn't cry long crying wasted energy. You were handed a task before you could walk, holding, fetching, watching, then soon, lifting, pulling, scrubbing. You didn't play. You learned to listen for orders, to move before being seen. The men around you were tired, angry, quiet. Their silence wasn't wisdom, it was weight. Life didn't feel like something you lived. It felt like something you carried. You grew into your hands before you grew into your name. Your fingers cracked before your voice did. You didn't go to school. You didn't learn to write. You learned to tie knots, to skin goats, to avoid debt, to survive the lash of those who could afford power. You knew what you were worth, not in dreams, in coin, in bushels, in bruises. You learned that your back had value only when it bent, that food was a reward, not a right, that rest was a risk. You envied no one, even the rich. They were not safer, only softer. And soft things broke. You learned not to break. You drank what was left. You ate what was given. You slept where you could. Your body was yours only when it failed. Then it was a burden. Until then, it was a tool. Your muscles grew early. So did your silence. You didn't ask questions. You didn't make plans. You didn't look at the stars. They were too far, too cruel. You looked at the ground, always the ground, because that's where your hands went. That's where the roots were. That's where the bodies fell. You worked with animals. They were kinder than people, more predictable. They didn't lie, didn't order, didn't steal. You trusted the donkey more than your master, the soil more than the gods. You prayed, but not loudly, not hopefully, just out of habit, because men before you had prayed. And maybe someone had listened once, or maybe not. You married, or Something like it. Two people surviving together. You didn't love. Not really. You depended. You shared. You argued quietly. You touched rarely. But you stayed. Because there was nowhere else. You had children. Or didn't. Sometimes they lived. Sometimes they didn't. You dug holes either way. You buried pieces of yourself with each one. But you kept moving. Because there was always another task. Another mouth. Another season. Your back curved. Your knees clicked. Your teeth ached. You didn't complain. Complaints were useless. You learned to count days by sunrise, not calendars. You knew when storms came by wind, not prophecy. You knew when your time was near by the way sleep crept heavier each night. No one wrote of you. No one asked your thoughts. No one praised your labor. You didn't leave statues. You left grooves. In tools. In walls. In paths. You didn't leave children who spoke your name in pride. Maybe they cursed it. Maybe they forgot it. You didn't mind. You didn't expect more. You didn't need a legacy. You needed shelter. Fire. Quiet. You wanted to die with breath in your chest, not with someone else's boot on it. That was your dream. Your highest dream. A death without violence. A sleep without cold. A final moment where you belonged to yourself, even for a second. You remembered a river once. You were young. You were alone. The water moved without purpose, without command, and you thought, this is what freedom must feel like. The memory stayed. It had no value, but it had warmth. That was enough. You told no one. It was yours. Yours alone. You aged like rope, frayed, pulled, tangled, still useful, still ignored. You weren't wise. You were tired, but people came to you. Not for counsel, for help, for things that hurt your body. Because you still could. That was your only woe. ATFT. You gave what you had. Not out of kindness, but out of momentum. That's what life was, momentum. Forward. Always forward. Until one day, it stopped. You stopped. And the world kept moving. No one noticed. No one paused. The sun rose. The wind blew. The tools were picked up by other hands. And you became part of the silence. Part of the dust. Part of the memory that no one named but everyone stood upon. You were forgotten. But you were real. You were not a hero. But you carried the weight of their stories. You were not noble. But you bore the cost of nobility. You were not free. But you gave freedom shape by contrast. And in that, you mattered. Quietly. Deeply. Always. You wake up cold, not just chilled. Cold deep in the bones. Not from weather, but from time. Your joints ache before you move. Your spine doesn't stretch anymore, it negotiates. The straw you sleep on doesn't cushion, it remembers. Every shape, every twist, every restless night. Your fingers are swollen. The knuckles protest. They remind you of every tool you've held, every stone you've lifted, every mistake that made you grip too tightly. You try to stand. Slowly, the world tilts. Your balance is a conversation now, a fragile truce. You don't speak when you move. You focus. Breathing isn't easy. It's not the air, it's the memory in your ribs. The cracks. The weight. You shuffle outside. The sun hasn't risen. You used to race the dawn. Now you wait for it. There is no food ready. No one brings it. No one checks. You used to feed others. Now you scrape, reheat, chew slowly. Bread that bites back. Olives that don't listen. You cough. Always. Not sick. Just worn. Your voice isn't used much anymore. People don't ask you things. When they do, it's usually about the past. They treat you like a well. A place to draw stories. They don't want you to speak of now. Now is inconvenient. Now is a mirror. You speak anyway, quietly, sometimes only to yourself. Your stories are shorter, not because you've forgotten, but because the details aren't welcome. No one wants the long truth. They want the short version, the palatable one, the one where wisdom fits in a sentence. You remember everything, not in order, not always clearly, but deeply, like echoes, smells, the sound of feet on stone, the color of blood in different light, the taste of dust. You remember voices long gone, faces you could draw blind, the ones you buried, the ones you failed, the ones who failed you. You walk when you can, slowly. People pass you. They don't see you, not really. Your background, a walking absence. You used to carry things. Now you carry nothing. And still, it feels heavy. You used to be useful. That was your identity. Now, you are tolerated. If that, some days, you're resented. For breathing, for needing, for reminding others what waits for them. You smile sometimes, out of habit, out of spite, to prove you still can. Your teeth are few, your skin is dry, you smell like years, you feel like memory. You sit in the sun, it warms parts of you nothing else can. You stare, not because you're lost, but because there's so little left to see. You've seen enough, and what remains is repetition. You used to fear death, then you forgot how. Now you feel it watching. Not cruel, not kind, just present. A shadow always nearby. You don't rush. You don't run. There's nowhere to run to. You've outlived most of your fears. And that's its own kind of horror. Emptiness, where terror used to live. You wish sometimes for pain. Sharp, clear pain. It made things feel real. Now, it's all dull, blurred, soft around the edges. You sleep often, not restfully, just to pass time. Time that no longer belongs to you. Time that's become surplus. You wake with confusion, not of where, but of why. You once had roles, tasks, reasons. Now, you have breath, and that's it. You are a guest in a world that doesn't remember inviting you. You stay out of the way. That's your skill now. Invisibility. You've mastered it. Even the gods don't bother with you. You stopped praying, not out of anger, just out of silence. Your faith wasn't answered. It aged, like you, and shriveled. You still notice things, cracks, shadows, shifts. You are a watcher, a ghost in flesh. You see people lie, pretend, hurt, hope. You don't judge, you just see. They think you don't understand, that you're slow, but they're the ones who miss the details. You see endings before they begin. You see patterns repeat. You've lived long enough to recognize cycles, and cages, and truths. You want to warn, but no one listens to warnings, only consequences. So you stay quiet. You wait. You sit. You cough. You smile. You remember. You forget. You rot. Gently. Privately. Unceremoniously. You've made peace with absence. With fading. With the great slow dissolve. You don't need monuments. You don't need legacy. You need kindness. A blanket. A touch. A name spoken without irritation. But you don't ask. Asking feels wrong now. You've learned to wait. If it come, as it comes. If not, you sleep. And one day, you won't wake. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just won't. And the world will go on. As it always has. And maybe just may someone will remember. Not your face. Not your name. But the shape of you. The feeling of you. The truth of an old man who endured. Pain was not a visitor. It was a tenant, a constant one. It didn't knock. It didn't ask permission. It just stayed. In your teeth, your gut, your limbs. Sometimes sharp, sometimes dull, but always present. You didn't ask what caused it. You didn't have the luxury. There were no diagnoses, no explanations, just whispers, just rumors. Maybe a curse, maybe bad air, maybe punishment. You didn't ask why. You asked if it would pass. And when it didn't, you waited longer. You coughed blood sometimes. You wiped it away. You didn't tell anyone. What could they do? They just avoid you, like death was contagious. And maybe it was. You limped, you leaned, you shook, but you kept moving. Because if you stopped, you became a burden. And burdens were left behind. Your stomach twisted often. Food was a risk. Water was worse. You drank from streams that fed the dead. You ate bread that fought your teeth. You chewed slowly, swallowed hard, prayed the cramps would be mild. They weren't. You vomited in silence. No one held your head. No one waited for you to finish. You cleaned yourself and moved on. You had no choice. Your skin cracked. Your fingers swelled. Your vision blurred. Sometimes you fainted. You woke on dirt, alone, dazed, the sun too bright, the ground too cold. But you got up, always up, because no one else would carry you. No one else had time. You knew people who rotted alive, from cuts, from bites, from things no one could name. Their bodies smelled before they died. Their eyes begged without hope. And when they went still, there was relief. Not just for them, for everyone. One less reminder, one less worry, one less mouth. You tried to help, sometimes. A cloth, a whisper, Ali, you'll be fine. But you didn't believe it. No one did. You feared fever, not because it hurt, but because it warned. It meant the end was near, and it came fast. Or slow, but always ugly. You saw people bleed for days, from places that shouldn't bleed. They wept, they screamed, then they stopped. And still, the world spun. The sun rose, the chores waited. Life didn't pause for pain, it stepped over it. You knew hierarchies, some kind, some cruel, all powerless. They crushed leaves, burned herbs, chanted names. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. No one knew why. You trusted them anyway, because you had nothing else. They cut sometimes, with dull blades, without mercy. They drained, stitched, scraped. You didn't scream. Screaming wasted strength. You bit down. You bled. You hoped. And when it failed, you cursed yourself for hoping. You watched children die. Quickly, without drama. One day warm, the next cold. No explanation, no warning, just silence. You watched women be giving life, blood on straw, breaths shallow, faces pale, no help. No one knew how. You watched men rot from the inside, grow thin, pale, lost, until they were just bones wrapped in skin. You told yourself it was natural, that God's planned it, but you didn't believe it. You knew it wasn't fate. It was neglect. It was ignorance. It was how the world worked when no one cared enough to ask why it hurt. You stopped hoping for health. You aimed for function. Could you walk? Could you lift? Could you chew? Then you were lucky. That was enough. You wrapped wounds in cloth. You stuffed herbs in your mouth. You drank bitter brews that burned more than they healed. You endured. That was the cure, not medicine. Endurance. You didn't speak of pain, not often. People grew tired of hearing it. They had their own. Everyone suffered. Quietly, desperately, alone. You prayed to gods with names you barely remembered. You made offerings you couldn't afford. You begged in whispers, but the gods were busy, or deaf, or cruel. You didn't know which. You didn't care. You prayed anyway, because it was something to do when your body betrayed you. You watched time change nothing. People still limped, still coughed, still screamed in the night, still vanished before their time. You stopped waiting for better. You made peace with worse. You sat in shadows. You watched the healthy with envy, not for their joy, but for their silence, their freedom from moans, from flinches, from blood. You hated the smell of rot. It stuck. On hands, on breath, on memory. You buried your dead shallow. Deep was too hard, too far, too cruel. You covered them in stones, in silence, in regret. And you didn't mourn long, because your own cough was back, your own fever rising, your own time coming. And no one would pause for you either. You sit alone. The stones are cold beneath you, not cruelly so, but indifferently. They don't care you're there. No one does. The house is quiet. It wasn't always. Once there were voices, laughter, arguments, life. Now there is dust, settled, confident, like it belongs more than you do. You speak sometimes, not to anyone, just to keep your voice from leaving. It cracks, it echoes, it disappears. You remember names, faces. You whisper them, like spells, like ghosts. You aren't sure if they're real anymore. Time blurs, memory softens. You used to be surrounded by neighbors, by kin, by sound. Now the world is a muffled thing, far away, distant, like it recoiled, like it forgot you. You walk to the edge of the village, slowly, painfully. No one notices, no one waves. You don't blame them. They're busy with living. You're busy with ending. You sit near the temple. You don't go in. You're not sure you're welcome, or if the gods still listen. You just sit. Watch the sky. It doesn't change. You do. You're smaller, thinner, quieter. The birds sing, not for you, but you listen anyway. Their song reminds you something is still alive. Not you, but something. You return home, if you can call it that. The walls know your weight. The door groans at your touch. You light a lamp. You stare at flame. It dances more than you do. You eat alone, slowly, carefully, as if the food might vanish, as if you might. The bowl is cracked. Like you sleep little. Dreams are rare. When they come, they hurt. They bring back voices you lost, touches you miss, hopes you buried. You wake with a start, every time. Your heart races, for nothing. You lie still, listen to the silence. It hums, it presses, it fills. You rise because you must, not because you want to. The day doesn't greet you. It unfolds around you. Indifferent, unaware. You sweep, you clean. Not because it matters, but because it reminds you you exist. You touch things, to feel something. The wood, the stone, the cold. It's all real. You hope. You light incense, not for gods, but for company. The smell lingers, like memory, like grief. You sit near the window. No one passes. No one knocks. You tell yourself that's good, peaceful, but it's not. It's hollow, the kind of quiet that scrapes, that hollows, that erases. You used to listen. Now you forget how. Your ears strain for anything, even complaints, even lies, anything but this endless soft nothing. You try to write. Your hand shakes. The words don't come. What would you say? To whom? You place the stylus down, slowly, like an old friend. You cry sometimes, not loudly, not with sobs, just a wetness, a leaking, a surrender. You wipe it away. not out of shame, but habit. You remember laughter, not yours, others. It was sharp, bright. You miss the noise, the clutter, the chaos. You miss being interrupted. You miss being expected. You miss being. You think of leaving, just walking, letting the road decide. But your legs disagree. So you sit. Again. Always. You think of fire, of letting it all burn. But even flame would need to be invited. And you're tired of summoning anything. You stare at your hands. They tremble. They ache. They tell your story. One of work, of care, of emptiness. You listen to your breath. Shallow. Stubborn. Still there. You wonder why. Not in despair. Just in confusion. What does it want? What more can it find? You remember someone said you were kind. Once. That you mattered. Once. It feels like another life. Another name. You think of the sea. You've never seen it. Only heard. It's vast. Loud. Alive. The opposite of you. You think that's fitting. You watch the door. You imagine it opening. Someone calling your name. Smiling. Needing you. But it doesn't. It never does. You wait anyway. Because that's all that's left. Waiting. For sound. For touch. For end. You sing. Once. Just a note. Just to hear. It dies quickly. Embarrassed. You close your eyes. You dream of warmth. Of arms. Of noise. Of being missed. Of being known. You wake to stillness. You speak to it. I'm still here, you say. But the silence doesn't answer. The altar is cold. Not from the stone, but from the years. From the neglect. The ash is old. The offerings, long gone. No one watches. No one kneels. Not anymore. You stand before it, unsure. Your hands tremble, not from faith, but from memory. You used to believe. You remember the names. Zeus, Apollo, Hera. You spoke them like charms, like shields. You thought they heard you. You thought they cared. But the drought came anyway. The sickness came anyway. The deaths came anyway. You prayed until your throat cracked. Nothing. Just whined. Just silence. Just absence. You gave your best. Olives. Wine. Bread. You bled into bowls. You sang praises. You obeyed. But still, your children died. Your fields died. Your hope died. One day, you stopped praying. Not from anger, from exhaustion. It felt pointless, like shouting into a cave that swallowed every sound. Now you return, not to rekindle, but to remember. To understand why it failed. You touch the altar. It feels like a stranger. You whisper a name. It feels like a lie. You look up. The sky is vast, empty, pale. It does not blink. It does not answer. You feel small, not humbled, forgotten. You sit. You breathe. You wait for something. Anything. But the wind is just wind. The leaves just leaves. The world moves without you. Without gods. Without meaning. You remember stories. Of miracles. Of interventions. But they sound distant. Like fairy tales. Meant for others. Never you. You remember the priest. His voice deep. His eyes hungry. He told you the gods punish the wicked. But you were good. You gave. You bowed. You wept. And still, they turned away. Or were never there. You don't know which hurts more. You tried to believe it was a test. A lesson. But the lessons never stopped. And the pain never taught. It only took. You watched the temples fall. Not from war. From time. From disinterest. Weeds grew through cracks. Animals nested inside. The divine became ruin. You pass one now. Its columns broken. Its statues faceless. No one guards it. No one mourns it. Children play there. They laugh. They climb. They forget. You envy them. You envy their ignorance, their freedom. You once feared wrath. Now, you fear nothing, because nothing ever comes. No lightning, no voice, no sign. Just decay, just stillness, just dust. You walk through the market. People barter. They shout. They lie. No one thanks the gods. No one invokes them. They trust coin, steel, luck. They are louder than faith ever was. You see a beggar. He whispers to Hermes. His hands shake. His eyes are gone. You see no miracle. Just flies. Just filth. Just waiting. You give him bread. He doesn't thank you. He doesn't notice. You walk on. You feel nothing. You pass the river. You used to believe it was sacred, that a spirit lived within, that it judged. Now it just floods, drowns, kills. It has no mercy, no memory. It just moves, like time, like truth, like death. You sit by its edge. You whisper again, just a test, just in case. But no breeze stirs, no light shines, no warmth comes, just water, just chill, just your own voice echoing back. You wonder when the gods died, or if they ever lived. Maybe they were stories, maybe they were tools, maybe they were never meant to answer, just to occupy silence, to tame fear. You fear less now, not because you're brave, because there's nothing left to lose, nothing sacred, nothing held, nothing divine. You light a fire, not a sacrifice, just for heat, just to see. The flame flickers, honest, present. You trust it more than Olympus. It gives, it takes, but it's real. You hear a child ask, "Who is Poseidon?" The mother shrugs. A story. The child nods, moves on. No awe, no weight, just a name in the dust. You smile, not in joy, in recognition. That's what remains. Names, stones, myths, but no thunder, no justice, no gods, just people, broken, breathing, waiting, always waiting. You stand. You walk. You leave the altar behind. You don't look back. There's nothing there. Just stone, just ash, just you. You forget. It starts small. A name, a place, a face. You shrug. It happens, but it grows. The forgetting. It spreads. Like mold, like rot. You reach for stories and find blanks. You try to recall laughter, but hear silence. Your father's voice fades. Your mother's hands blur. Their lessons become noise. Their love, a fog. You try to write it down, but the words resist. They curl. They hide. They die. You tell yourself it's just age, just life. But it feels like theft, like pieces stolen in sleep. You speak to others, ask questions. They smile, nod, but they don't remember either. You ask about the war, the famine, the fire. They blink, confused. Was that here? They ask. You nod. You're sure, but now you're not. You visit the elder. He's blind now, his mind a broken jar. He talks to ghosts. He forgets who you are. You cry. Not for him, for what he carried, for what is now gone. He was a library, now ash. You walk the village. The stones are the same. The trees, the hills, but their names are wrong or missing. You point, ask. No one knows. You try to teach the children, tell them tales. They laugh. That didn't happen. That's not real. You insist, but your voice sounds unsure. Even to you, you look at old carvings. They're worn, weathered. The gods have no faces, The heroes, no swords. The words are faded. You touch them, but they tell you nothing. You see a woman knitting. The pattern looks familiar. You ask, what does it mean? She shrugs. My mother taught me. What did it mean to her? She doesn't know. You nod, of course. That thread is cut. That root is dry. You light a lamp. You stare at flame. Try to remember your first fire, your first prayer, your first death. They slip, like fish, like dreams. You visit a grave. The name is gone. The stone cracked. You kneel, whisper, hope someone listens. But no one does. Not even you. You forget why you came. You walk home. The path is wrong. The house unfamiliar. You blink, panic, then calm. This is normal now. This is forgetting. You find a scroll. You try to read. The letters twist. Your lips fail. You place it down, afraid, ashamed, empty. You hear a song, faint, from a window. You know it, or think you do. You hum along. A child asks, what's that? You open your mouth. Pause. I don't know. She runs off. You stare. You grieve. For what? You're not sure. Just loss. Just echo. Just fading. You keep a box. Inside are things. A comb. A spoon. A coin. You don't know why, but they feel important. You touch them daily. Like prayers. Like anchors. One day, you forget the box. You find it a week later. Dusty. Foreign. You lift the spoon. Whose was this? No answer. You place it down. Like a stranger, you stop dreaming. Or stop remembering dreams. It's the same. Your sleep is blank. Your thoughts quiet. You forget your age, your story, your shape. A neighbor greets you. You fake a smile. Their name is gone. So is their child's. So is yours. You sit by the river. You used to fish here. You think, maybe, the water flows. It remembers nothing. Like you. You see a wedding. The bride's song is new, bright, but empty. No one sings the old songs. They're forgotten. Too hard, too strange, too slow. You whisper them alone. Broken. You hear birds. You forget their names, but not their cries. Not yet. You chase memories like shadows. They vanish. Always. You try to leave marks on trees, in dirt. But the wind steals them. The rain erases. Time unwrites. You cry for your mother, but forget her face. You hold her shawl. It smells like dust. Not her. You forget what she called you. You forget your own name. You wake one morning. The sun is wrong. The room foreign. You don't panic. You just blink. You sit. Wait. Someone enters. Smiles. Says a name. It doesn't fit, but you nod. It's easier. You walk the garden. The flowers are bright. You used to know their names, their seasons. Now you just see colors. You forget pain. That part is kind. You forget grief. That part is cruel. You forget love. That part is death. One day you hear your name, a voice, soft, familiar. You turn. No one is there. You smile. It's the last thing you remember. You sit on the steps. The stone is warm. The sun dips low. Shadows stretch. You don't speak. There's no one to hear. The village is quiet. Not asleep. Not dead. Just quiet. Chickens rustle. A dog licks its paw. Smoke curls from one roof. You watch. Not with purpose. Just because. The world doesn't need you. It never did. But for a while, you believed it did. You built. You sowed. You prayed. You lost. You survived. And now, you sit. You remember your hands. How strong they were. How they bled. How they held. Now they tremble. soft, forgotten. You trace a line on the step, nothing happens. You don't expect it to. A child passes, doesn't see you. Good. You don't want to explain. What would you say? That you lived? That you tried? That it wasn't enough? That it never is? You close your eyes, not to sleep, just to rest. You hear a fly, a cartwheel, a cough. You feel your breath, thin, but there. You wait, not for someone, just for the moment to pass. All moments do. You think of a sea you once saw, blue beyond blue. You never touched it, just watched, like now. You wonder if that was the peak, just seeing, just knowing it was there. You try to remember the name of the city, of the man beside you. It slips. They all slip. You feel no fear. You've forgotten how to fear. It was useful once. Now it's noise, like ambition, like pride, like youth. You hear laughter. It doesn't stir you. It belongs to others, not you. Not anymore. You lived in the fire once. Now you watch smoke. It's enough. You eat when hungry, sleep when tired. You don't hope. That takes energy. You don't despair. That takes belief. You just are. A neighbor nods. You nod back. Two ghosts in daylight. You wonder if he forgets too. Probably. That's mercy. You used to hate the gods. Now you think they're tired. Like you. Maybe they gave up. Maybe they were never meant to last. Like stories, like bodies, like breath. You scratch your leg. It itches. That feels real. More than memory. More than myth. You hear a girl recite something. A lesson. A list. A lie. You smile. It won't last, but let her have it. Let her believe. For now, you sit until the stone cools. Then you rise. Slowly. Every joint a protest. Every step a whisper. You walk nowhere. Just away. From the steps. From the sun. From the day. You pass a fig tree. You pick one. Bite. It's sweet. You remember sweetness. Not often. But now, you pass a gate. It creaks. Like a friend calling. You ignore it. You don't want company. You want distance. You reach a field. Dry. Empty. But it held wheat once. You think. Maybe. You kneel. Press your hand into dirt. It's warm. It holds you. Better than people. Better than gods. You stay. Just stay. Until stars come. And wind hums. And eyes close. Not to dream. Just to end the day. That's all. That's enough. You do not weep. You have no tears. You do not pray. You have no words. You do not wait. You have no reason. You are not remembered. You are not named. You are not told, but you are still quiet.